Okay, so we should be live. Hopefully I'm live here. I can see on my test screen that I am live indeed. So thank you very much for joining me. I'm just going to get set up here and I'm going to talk away as I'm getting set up as I normally do. Thank you so much for joining. I can see the attendance already is pretty great, which is super duper because it is quite late for some of you. So I just want to say thank you so much for joining this SCS crash course, which is a really large session that we did the last time for the previous window, and it was really popular. So I said I would do it again. I'm just going to kind of wait for a few people to join. I'm conscious of the fact that we've just kicked off, so some people will just get notifications from YouTube. So thank you so much everyone for joining. Just let me know if you can hear me. One of the unique things of YouTube Live is I don't actually know if you can hear me or not. So I rely on audience participation on that one. So if everyone can hear me, you can see my screen, you can see the slides, you can see myself. Please do let me know. And then once I know, I can kick off. Okay, so let me know if my audio is okay. We had a situation before where I had two mics running and actually it sounded crazy, right? I had like an echo. And I wouldn't have known that without someone telling me. Okay, I can see some positive stuff. Okay, excellent. Okay, well guys, thank you so much for joining me. This will be a really useful session for you, I promise. I'll be giving you as much information as I can. This is not necessarily a big marketing webinar. Of course, there is some marketing to it, but there's a lot of value here. I wouldn't have a session on a bank holiday if I didn't think it was important to you, or it's just, I suppose, just in general, it's not really my style just to run a big marketing webinar or anything like that. Okay, so look, I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction into what we're going to be looking at here and just some general information before we get stuck in. So this session is probably going to last about 3 hours. I don't really want to get it to the 4 hours mark because I have a dog and I just want to make sure he's not going crazy. Because I want to make sure that this is a nice clean recording. So 4 hours is probably the cap. Obviously I'm human as well and you guys want to go to sleep, and some of you are in time zones where it's actually quite late at the moment. So I'll try as much as possible to get through this as quickly as I can without speeding through it necessarily. Some people have said that I talk very quickly. I do. It's a part of sort of where I'm from. People talk very fast, but it's also because I want to make sure that we get through this within a reasonable period of time. There's a lot of information to get through here. If you are a Pro Accountancy customer, if you're someone who has purchased a course, these slides come from the CBT sessions. Within the course itself, there's professional recordings for every single core activity, and we go into a little bit more detail than what we cover here. But if you are a customer of mine, you will have seen this information already. Okay, so just before we get stuck in, my name is Hugh Martin, okay, and I'm just going to kind of pull up the first slide. You may have guessed I own the business Pro Accountancy. I've been in this business for quite some time. Maybe you've seen me on different videos, you've seen me maybe on CIMA articles, or maybe you've seen me on the FLP. I'm sort of everywhere, or LinkedIn or Facebook, whatever. Basically, I'm fully CIMA qualified as well. I think that's probably the most important thing to say. I've been teaching, I've been helping students, I've been helping fully qualified members as well with various different things. I was a prize winner myself, okay, so I've done all of these exams. And these days, I reach thousands of people each window, okay, between all the various different programs that I do. My own website has really just completely gotten out of control with demand, which is fantastic. I'm absolutely delighted. But also through the FLP, I reach many, many, many people. And you may have seen me on the sort of pre-recorded videos for the various different case levels. Maybe you've seen me with other providers as well in the past. So, hopefully I have helped you out throughout your journey. Sometimes I get people saying, a video you did years ago helped me out, and I like to see those comments. It makes me think, wow, I've done quite a lot in the last few years. So look, I've written a textbook on the SCS. I assist CIMA with various different international projects. So, in China, the United States, those are kind of the two that I look after. And the reason why I mention that is because the things that I'm saying, they are backed up with practice, and I suppose I use these, okay, for these different types of programs. This isn't just stuff that I pulled out of nowhere. This is stuff that I use for cohorts in other countries. Pro Accountancy is a global business. We have customers everywhere: South Africa, China, Malaysia, UK, you name it, Canada. We have customers all over the place. Okay, so look, as I said, I own Pro Accountancy. Enough about me. You'll notice that the number was there for my WhatsApp. If you want to get in touch with me on WhatsApp, please do. I'd be happy to help you out with products or in ways we can sort of help you prep for this upcoming SCS. So let's get stuck into core activity A. So this part of this session is going to look at core activity A, and how this works is we're going to look at each of the core activities and we're going to say, right, what could actually be tested from these core activities? And if you don't know what a core activity is, basically a core activity is a big chunk of the syllabus. So there's 5 core activities, A, B, C, D, and E, and the SCS syllabus basically is all of these different core activities put together. Okay, now they're quite broad, they're quite big, and you'll see that as we go through it. So the whole point of this session is to see, right, what does this actually mean? What could I be tested based on this core activity? And we're going to go through each of them individually. Okay, so the first core activity A, what is it? It's develop business strategy. Okay, so you can see what I mean. This is massive. What does this actually mean? Well, within the core activities, you have assessment outcomes, and those kind of break it up into smaller bits, but even those can be a little bit vague. Okay, so as you can see here, I can evaluate strategic options, digital and otherwise. I can recommend strategic decisions, digital and otherwise. I can evaluate potential acquisitions and divestment opportunities. I can recommend responses to opportunities and threats arising from digital technologies. So yes, it's good to have these. These are freely available from the CIMA website. They're called the strategic blueprints, and you can see them. I believe they're on page 18. I'm not 100% certain though, because there's a new edition now. Basically, these give you some indication as to what is maybe being testable here within core activity A, but let's look at it in more granular detail for this upcoming window. Now, I just want to kind of note here, you'll see here different references beside each of the theory areas. These reference the videos within the Pro Accountancy course, okay? So you'll see C1, D6. These aren't referring to any of the subjects, P3, E3, and F3. These are referring to videos. If you're a customer of mine, you can see a full video on this theory area if, for example, it's something that you don't understand, okay? So values is the first, and values have been tested loads within this core activity. I think it could be highly testable for this upcoming window. It's really easy to test, okay? If you're an exam writer, it's something that is really easy just to throw in there. And these are the different types of theories that I think you should know. So the first is evaluating strategies and proposals using the values. Okay, so you may be given a question that asks you to evaluate the consistency of the values with a given strategy or proposal, okay? And this is a very common question. There's different adaptations of it. In the last window, you were examined on the consistency of the mission, the vision, and the values with the strategy or proposal, okay? And really here, what you should be looking at is which ones are consistent and which ones are not, okay? So it's very much specific to the scenario that you're given. We'll run through an example in just a few minutes, but basically you look at which values are consistent with the strategy or proposal and which ones are not. And there may be values that are not relevant at all, and you can mention that. The next is the relevance of the values, okay? So in some situations, even if it's inconsistent, the values with the strategy, you can always say in your arguments that this isn't the only way we should evaluate a strategy, okay? So maybe a strategy is not in alignment with our values, but maybe we can change our values, okay? And that could be another potential scenario, changing values, okay? So should we change our values? Should we add a value? Should we remove a value? Okay, what are the implications of that? So there's only so many times you can do this, because if you keep on changing your values, you know, the perception is that you don't take the values very serious, right? So that's a major issue. If you add a value, what are you saying about the business? If you take away a value, what are you saying about the business? You're saying, well, we think this is important if we're adding a value, and if we take away a value, we're saying, well, we don't think this is important. Okay, so just think about the messaging. So you may change values in relation to a new strategy. Possibly we pursue a new strategy and therefore we look to change values as a result of that. You may have an acquisition. So maybe you purchase a new business and maybe we change our values in response to this acquisition. Okay, we're looking to maybe encourage integration, that kind of stuff. The next is the influence that values should have over behavior. So this has come up before in the past where there was a question about, should values have prevented a quality issue from occurring? And in theory, yes, okay, adherence to values, if they relate to quality, you know, with Leotard, there's excellence in all things. Yes, okay, so strict adherence to those values should prevent quality issues from occurring. But at an operational level, there's only so much you can do, okay? So operational level staff, they're not going to be experts in the corporate values. They likely would have seen them once and then forgotten about them, okay? And you can mention that in your answer. It's up to the board and the strategic level to ensure that there's a culture there that supports the values, okay? So at an operational level, they're not going to have a very thorough view on those values. So the next thing is the mission and the vision. Okay, so really important. This has been tested loads, and some of you may be thinking, do I need to learn the values, the mission, the vision before I go into the exam? And generally speaking, what happens is in the exam is you're given them in the reference materials if they are examined. Okay, so generally speaking, that's the case. Now, don't quote me on that because it could change. But do remember you have a digital copy of the pre-scene within your exam, so you can always go into that and look at what the values are, look at what the mission is or the values, okay? So just remember that. So the first style of question that comes up is evaluating strategies and proposals in terms of their consistency with the mission and consistency with the vision. And it's very similar to what we talked about with the values. You know, consistency, is it consistent with it? Is it not? It will depend on the strategy, okay? So your answer should be highly specific to the scenario. Now, the next piece is the relevance of this consistency, exactly what we said with the values, okay? So you can say here, well, okay, it's not consistent with our mission statement. It's not consistent with our vision, but we can always change them, okay, in relation to this new strategy that we have. You may get questions around compliance with mission and vision. So possibly we acquire a business and it turns out that they weren't necessarily abiding by their mission and their vision. So how do we ensure compliance? Okay, so that maybe could come up. That's really kind of a question around strategic management. How do we encourage the business now to kind of comply with its mission and vision? And you may get questions around whether it should have complied with its mission and vision. And that question is a little bit more challenging, and that did come up before. And if you have a question like that, just remember, yes, it should in theory. That's the long-term objective essentially of the business. They should have been abiding by it, but of course we don't know the scenario in this case. Maybe the business was failing and they had to engage in actions just to survive. Okay, so that may be a justification for why they weren't abiding by their own mission and their vision. So adaptations, you may have questions where we change the mission and vision. So should we adapt it in response to a new strategy? And of course, it's the exact same thing as the values. What signal does this send to the markets? Okay, so if we're changing, you know, our vision, if we're changing our mission, what does that say about the business? Okay, and there's only so many times you can do this. If you do it loads, you come across like you don't take the mission or the vision that seriously because you keep on changing. Okay, so that's something just to bear in mind with those types of questions anyways. Okay, so this one is important, right? Strategic matters. This is kind of like a tricky one, right? So this comes up every now and again and it catches people out because it's not really something that's easy to just pick up in a book. Okay, it's very specific to the scenario. So you may get a question that says, what constitutes a strategic decision? Okay, so maybe you're given an action and then you're asked, okay, is this a strategic decision? Okay, sounds like a really basic question, but it's actually quite a tricky one, right? So what you should be thinking about, if it's strategic decision or strategic matter, same thing really, is the following. So the timeline, okay, does it have a long-term impact? Okay, is this going to affect the business in the long run? Okay, so that's the main thing you should be thinking about. So is it a decision that will have a big long-term material impact on the business? So we're talking about impact. Is it going to have a big impact essentially on the business? And what about the implications? What about the consequences? Will it have far-reaching consequences in terms of stakeholders, risk, reputation, share price, all those different things? If the answer is yes, then it's probably a strategic decision. So those types of questions come up every now and again. It's a little bit of a tricky one, but just think about, you know, long-term impacts, risk, reputation, those big issues. Chances are it's a strategic issue. Okay. So the next thing is scenario planning, and this comes up pretty much every round. It has been kind of one of these topics that has different parts tested within it sometimes, and sometimes it's just tested by itself. Okay. So it's a bit of a tricky one. Sometimes you'll see it within core activity D. Doesn't really matter too much, okay? So whether it's an A or D, you still have to do it, okay? So the first style of question that comes up is evaluating the impact of scenarios. Actually not the worst question. So you may be given a series of scenarios and then you're asked to evaluate, you know, the impact of those scenarios. When you're thinking about the answers to these questions, just think about the consequences, okay? And you don't have to do really many fancy things really with these types of questions. Sometimes I see people, they don't say the obvious because they think that they should maybe have a more complex answer, but actually sometimes you can give kind of an obvious answer. Okay, so an increase in interest rates, it's going to have an effect on our finance costs. It's okay to say that. Now obviously you should say more, but you know, that is a valid point, right? So it's okay to have a simple answer. recommending responses to scenarios. So you may be given a series of scenarios, maybe 3, maybe 2, and then you have to recommend a response. So it's very difficult for me to answer a question on that with no context or anything like that. But just remember, if you're given a series of scenarios and you have to respond to them, just make sure that your answer is addressing the scenario itself, okay? Really important. You're probably thinking to yourself, Hugh, that advice is really stupid. But it's not, because I can tell you I have marked hundreds of papers, even just last month. And this is really common, where you'll be given a scenario and the actual response doesn't really coordinate with the scenario, okay? Benefits of scenario planning. So it allows us to develop a response. We can look at the different variables associated with the scenarios, okay? So we can look at those variables, track them, and hopefully it'll give us a warning sign as to whether those scenarios will actually pan out. Now, of course, there are some limitations, right? So scenario planning could be a great waste of time. It's unlikely that scenarios will exactly happen the way we envisage them to. So, this is something just to consider. So how scenario planning could be used is another one as well. So how do we actually put it together? Now, this question is a little bit more basic, okay? So this question hasn't come up in a while. CIMA have increased the difficulty of the questions around scenario planning to go beyond just how do we put one together. But for many people, this one would be actually quite tricky, and I would find this one a bit of a struggle myself. So how do we put together a scenario plan? It starts with identifying the material factors associated with what we're planning, okay? So let's say, for example, maybe a factor might be something like interest rates. Then we create scenarios. So the interest rate increases, okay? That's a scenario. And then we develop the scenario. So if it increases, what happens next? Okay, well, maybe our demand goes down, okay, something like that. And then we develop responses. So what do we do? Maybe we change the business model. That's quite drastic. Maybe we engage in something like swaps. I don't know, maybe to manage interest rate risk, something like that. Maybe we change prices. Depends on the scenario. Okay, so the last one here is types of strategies. Now, this one, again, is a little bit of a tricky one. It kind of comes up every now and again as a sort of smaller question. It would really catch people out, if I'm being honest, for this particular pre-scene. So this is why I've included it. So whether a decision allows the pursuit of a cost leadership strategy or differentiation strategy. This style of question has come up before for differentiation strategy, not cost leadership yet. So you'll be given maybe a new strategy that Leotair is looking to pursue, maybe a proposal, maybe an actual strategy itself. And you're asked, does this allow the business to pursue this type of strategy, a differentiation strategy or cost leadership? So we both probably know what they are, okay? So we know that cost leadership is, being the lowest cost provider in the market. Differentiation, do we have this perceived difference within the market? So if, for example, the strategy is to use, let's say we get a big order for loads of standardized satellites or something like that, does that allow us to pursue a cost leadership strategy? To an extent, it gives us some scale, so it would bring down the cost, but there are some other considerations there. In terms of differentiation, we'll cover that in just a few minutes. So using an emergent approach came up before, so this is like putting together a strategy. The emergent approach is where we basically have a strategy and then we adapt it based on what's going on in the market, okay? So this style of question came up before, should we use it? Is it a good idea? Yes, okay, so in this particular industry, it is a good idea because the alternative is to have a very fixed and rigid plan and then, kind of see how it goes and not make any adjustments as we go. Now, that's not realistic in this world that we live in at the moment with, changing economic variables and, even with the satellite industry, it's a fast moving industry. It's quite a rapidly growing industry. So it wouldn't make sense to have a rational plan where we plan 12 months in advance and we make no adaptations. Okay, it just wouldn't make sense. And very, very few businesses really operate like that these days. Okay, so when these models were put together, business was a lot more stable, I would assume. Okay, so in this case, yes, it's good because the strategy is updated based on current circumstances, which would be relevant for this industry in particular. It's fast moving, the pace is dynamic, and it's a technologically focused industry. There's going to be new technologies that need to be implemented into satellites in order to make them appealing for clients. Now, one of the risks with using an emergent approach though is that you can have alignment issues. So if you keep on adapting your strategy, it can actually detract away from the underlying mission and vision sometimes. Okay, so you need to make sure if you are making adaptations to strategies that they still stick within the mission and the vision. Okay, so the last one, actually, I thought that was the last one, types of strategies, is acquisitions. And this one comes up a lot, okay? So evaluating, there's different styles of questions I'm going to just go through here, but they all are similar enough. So we could be asked here in relation to an acquisition, Evaluate the suitability, acceptability, and feasibility, right? So we're all kind of, I suppose, well versed with this. This is everyone's favorite question, right? So we all know suitability, acceptability, feasibility, and we'll talk about that in the next core activity as well. But you could be asked this in relation to an acquisition, okay? The next is arguments for and against, okay? So very straightforward there. Strengths and weaknesses, effectively the same thing. Factors to consider, pretty much the same thing. And we could also be given this one, which is a little bit different, strategic implications of a specific acquisition. So we're focusing on consequences. So what are the consequences of this acquisition? Does it increase our risk, share price? What about synergies? Does it bring down operational costs? Okay, so those are the things we should consider. Now, you may have a question around resource audits. Hasn't come up in a while, but it's a really easy one if it does come up. So basically a resource audit is where we just investigate what resources we have. So you may have a resource audit if you're looking to make an acquisition and you're just checking to see, do we have the skills? Do we have the finances? Do we have the appropriate culture to acquire another business? Okay. And post-acquisition issues, every now and again this comes up. Typically this actually comes up within the scope of core activity E in regards to corporate governance. So it's something we'll cover in just a few minutes, but post-acquisition issues, what can occur here? You could maybe have staff leaving the business if we acquire the business. You can have questions here around ensuring that staff are aware of our values, our mission, vision, those types of things. So those can be kind of post-acquisition issues. So here's some potential questions. Now, within the course, the Pro Accountancy course, I go through this in a lot more detail, but I'm just going to give you kind of an overview of different questions you may get, and we're just going to fly through them here. So the first with values is recommending whether values should change after acquiring a component supplier. So should our values change? And remember what I said, maybe, okay, so maybe we should actually change our values because we've acquired a new business, may make it easier to integrate that business into our business. If we've taken one of their values, we're showing that we think it's an important acquisition because we've made such a big change to our values. However, we already have a lot of values. So if we add another one, there's a risk there that we're diluting our values just for no real reason, okay? Evaluating whether adherence to values could have prevented a quality issue related to a satellite. This is one that we already covered, and it's one that came up before many years ago for a pre-scene called PixelWiz. Evaluating the consistency of a proposal to acquire an overseas spaceport with Leotair's values. Okay, so this style of question has come up loads, okay? The consistency of this particular course of action with our values. And, sometimes it will be consistent, sometimes it won't, and sometimes it'll be both, okay? So mission and vision. So evaluate whether the acquisition of an AI developer that creates software for satellites is consistent with the mission. What I would do here is I would actually break the mission up into different bits, and I would see, is this consistent with it? Is this? This is something that we'll look at in a few minutes. So if you're a little bit confused, don't worry about it. Evaluate the argument that an acquired company should have been acting in alignment with its mission and vision. So we talked about this already. Evaluate the arguments for and against the revision of the mission if Leotair offers satellite data as a service. And this is something that I talk about in the pre-scene review, where we look at the pre-scene. I said, a possible question here could be possibly Leotair offering the data that it generates as a service. Okay, so if we revise the mission, we're possibly taking this into consideration, the fact that we have adapted the business model. However, as I said, we don't want to be updating the mission every single time we make a slight strategic move. Okay, we need to have a mission statement that stays consistent for many years to come, because it's a long-term objective. Okay, the next is strategic matters. So evaluate the arguments for and against cyber risk being treated as a strategic matter to be managed by the board. This came up before in an exam, and I actually think a provider has recently used it in one of their mocks. You see that sometimes with tuition providers. And this question is tricky, right? Because it's asking you, is this important enough to warrant being a strategic matter? And this actually could kind of come up for Leotair because there's no mention of cyber risk. So actually, we may have a cyber attack, and then there's kind of this consideration. Actually, is this a strategic issue? And of course it is, because we think about the materiality of cyber risk. If we have a cyber attack, if there's maybe data breach or something like that, that's going to be a really, really significant issue for this business. So yes, it's going to be a strategic matter. And if it wasn't treated as a strategic matter, it probably wouldn't be resolved. Okay, it wouldn't really be managed in the right way. Okay, but on the flip side, it's important to note that the board's role here is not operational, in that they're not the ones that are implementing the controls. They're not the ones that are implementing all the various different measures that protect the business from cyber attacks. Okay, they need to delegate that responsibility. So yes, it's a strategic matter, but it is just that, a strategic matter. It's not necessarily up to the board to be actively involved with cyber risk at a very detailed level. So the next here, evaluate the argument that a recent quality issue is a strategic matter because it affected the share price. This style of question came up before, again for PixelWiz, and it's an interesting question. So the answer here is yes, to an extent. Okay, so yes, because there's an expectation from shareholders that we would resolve this issue, especially if it's a big impact. But we need to be very careful here that we're not just changing our strategy or adapting the business in response to, very short-term movements in share price. Okay, we should be thinking longer term than this. Recommend whether a decision to purchase an additional workshop constitutes a strategic decision. Think about the factors that I said there, long-term, materiality, all those different things. So scenario planning, recommend responses to scenarios around increasing interest rates and a strengthening of the W dollar. This style of question, again, it will depend on the context. It'll depend on the different scenarios that you're given, but just look at the scenarios and make sure that you're expanding upon them, okay? That you're responding to them and that you're thinking about the wider issues as well, okay? And that you're directly responding to the scenarios that are given. So discuss how Leother might benefit from applying scenario planning to the possibility of a client becoming insolvent. I think this style of scenario may actually pop up in your exam, where you have a customer maybe at risk of becoming insolvent or maybe bankrupt or something like that. If you do get something like this, what I would suggest is that think about the benefits, right? So the biggest benefit is that we're able to respond quicker because we've thought about this in advance, and we're also able to look at the different variables that we have projected out to say, if this changes, then actually it's likely that our customer will become insolvent. So maybe it's the case that we have a scenario where we predict that if there's a certain amount of, let's say the interest rate increases to a certain extent, that we would expect the customer to go bankrupt or insolvent, then yes, okay, we will be looking at that factor as we go, which will be really important for us because we're kind of getting I suppose maybe a predictor as to when this is actually going to happen. So recommend how scenario planning might be used to plan for rumored legislation on rocket launches. So we talked about the various different steps, looking at the factors and so on. So recommend whether the acceptance of a large contract helps Leother to pursue a cost leadership strategy. So we talked about this. It gives us scale, which yes, it would allow us to bring down our costs, but it's not like, tins of bread or something like that, right? This is a really tricky industry. It's not the case that if we get like a load of orders that this is just, the scale gives us huge cost advantages. The business has issues kind of fulfilling the amount of orders that it has already. So you would have to ramp up the infrastructure in the business. You would have to increase the workshop size. You would have to, invest in machinery and staff and raw materials, and so this is something that you should consider. It maybe the cost advantages are limited in that case, especially if it just comes in really quickly. So evaluate whether the use of emerging lasercom technology. So lasercom technology is technology that allows satellites to communicate with each other through lasers. It's considered much faster than the radio frequency technology that they currently use. So let's say we have this technology, allows Leother to pursue a differentiation strategy. The answer is yes, if we're the only company that's using it, or if we're using it possibly in a better way than existing companies. But of course, over time, that advantage will be eroded. Okay, so in a fast-moving industry like this, we expect our competitors to also use it eventually, and therefore our advantage is lost. We're not necessarily differentiated in that case. So recommend whether an emergent approach to developing strategies for providing satellite solutions is suitable. We kind of talked about this already. Yes, it is, but there are some limitations there. So evaluate the strategic implications of acquiring a company that creates biofuel rockets. Okay, so what are the implications, the consequences, things as you said like synergies, risk management, possibly the share price. You need more information here to answer these types of questions properly. Evaluate the arguments for and against endorsing a bid to be acquired by a defense conglomerate. So you may be given a situation where Leother is acquired. This has happened before, but only once. Okay, so is it going to happen again? I don't know. Okay, if it does happen, in this case, one of the arguments for it could be possibly a strategic benefit as part of being in this conglomerate. Maybe the conglomerate has contracts with the government that are difficult to obtain, and as a result, we get access to them. That's a good thing. But the negative is that possibly it's not good for long-term shareholder value. Maybe we'll be forgotten about in this big, massive conglomerate. So recommend the matters to consider when conducting a resource audit prior to acquiring a component supplier. We talked about this already. Okay, so this is probably the most appealing part to everyone who's looking at this session. If you're looking at the recording or if you're looking at it live, it's the worked example. Okay, so let's have a look at the question here. And what I would suggest, if you are looking at the recording, once I go through the question, just pause it, because I'm going to go through the question fairly quickly. So Leotair's board has recently identified a potential acquisition target. It's a company called BioLaunch, okay, so just a made up name, based in Northland. It's a startup company that creates rockets powered by biofuel. Now, sometimes you will get these kind of random scenarios in your exam. They don't really make a whole lot of sense, and sometimes I have to think like this to match the exam, okay? So does this make loads of sense for this business to do this? Maybe not, but this is what could come up in your exam, okay? So BioLaunch's single rocket design uses biopropane, which is a natural gas and a byproduct from biodiesel production. And the company's rocket creates 89% less emissions than a rocket fueled by refined kerosene, which is sort of the standard for most rockets these days. So the company has to date had 3 successful launches. Now, all of this information is relevant, okay? And it's something that the examiner has said in the most recent set of examiner's reports. You should be going through this background information very carefully. So the question says, evaluate the acquisition of BioLaunch in terms of its consistency with Leotair's mission statement. It's worth 50%. So I would recommend here that you would have at least 4 paragraphs. Okay, 5 if you have enough time, but 4 you could still get full marks, okay? So the mission statement, let's just pull it up here. So it's to lead in the creation and operation of satellites that meet the needs of clients for space-based facilities. So let's get stuck into the answer. So the first bit that I would look at is the creation of satellites. So is it consistent with the creation of satellites? Well, the simple answer is not really, okay? So Leotair's mission is to lead in the creation of satellites that meet the needs for clients for space-based facilities, but BioLaunch has no satellite manufacturing operations, okay? So this part of the mission does not align with the strategy or the proposal or the acquisition. It could be argued that the acquisition would actually hurt this part of the mission because it will act as a distraction, okay? So it will take our focus away from our core business, which is basically producing satellites, okay? So that's the first area, that's the first inconsistency. The next is the operation. So again, we're looking at little bits here. So lead in the operation of satellites. So the acquisition of BioLaunch will not necessarily help Leotair with operating satellites either. We think about the operation of a satellite, and this is where the pre-scene comes in. It only occurs when the launch has been executed successfully, and biofuels doesn't really factor into this. So yes, it's sustainable. Yes, it's a good thing for the environment, but it doesn't really impact the operations, okay, from the information that we've been given, okay? So does it really help us with this part of the mission? Not really. And if we look at the information that we've been given, 3 successful launches to date is not a big sample size, okay? So we don't really know for sure how reliable are these rockets, how reliable is this, it's, as it says there, biopropane that the business uses. Okay, so let's look at the consistency. So if we look at a long-term perspective of this, it is actually consistent, but we need to look at it from a very long-term perspective. So if we look at the mission statement, lead in the creation and operation of satellites. Okay, if we think back to the pre-scene, it kind of touches on the fact that there may be environmental concerns associated with rockets. So the environmental impact, it's inevitable that it's going to become an issue for the Wexland government as launches increase, as it is in the real world, okay? So if there's new laws around the type of fuel that you can use within rockets, if those are ever introduced, well, we would actually be ahead of the curve, and we wouldn't have to, kind of scurry around looking for, rockets that use the appropriate fuel type. We would actually be sorted, so it wouldn't cause a disruption in the operations of the business necessarily. So that's one way in which it is somewhat consistent, okay? So we've kind of put a hypothetical there. Now the vision, so whilst the strategy is not fully in alignment with the mission, it does help with the vision. And this is why it's good sometimes to know the mission and the vision and the values without having the pre-scene open, because you can maybe pull from this. So Leotair's vision is to provide space-based facilities that enhance the quality of life on Earth. But if we think about the nature of this acquisition, basically we're looking to improve the sustainability aspect of Leotair. So at the current moment in time, we're using harmful fuels. However, if we were to integrate this, kind of more sustainable fuel type into our business, this would help improve the quality of life on Earth, okay, versus what we currently do. So it could actually be argued that this is in alignment with our vision, okay? So yes, it's somewhat, inconsistent with our mission, but it is, consistent enough with the vision statement. So here is the last one, and this is something that you can generally pull into all of these types of questions around consistency with values, consistency with vision, and consistency with mission. So the acquisition sways more towards being inconsistent, even though we had a point on consistency there. It does sway more towards inconsistency. However, the lack of consistency shouldn't be the only basis by which we assess. Okay, so we should look at more factors here. Obviously, does it generate shareholder value? In this case, it improves the sustainability impact of the business. So that's important from a risk management perspective and from an ESG perspective. So in this case, what we could do is we could very easily adapt the mission statement to be the creation, launch, and operation of satellites. And that would easily fix this problem. Okay, so that's an answer there to this type of question. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just get a glass of water here because my voice is already going. Okay, so I'm just going to look at a few questions here. Okay, yeah, it's uploaded after, so you're right, it is actually uploaded after. The question mentioned mission. It's okay to bring in vision too. Yes, as long as you have noted the fact that it's somewhat inconsistent with the mission. However, we should consider the fact that there are some consistencies there with the vision. So it maybe creates a little bit of a question as to whether we should just be looking at the mission statement. Okay, so I suppose you would need to bring in the mission to a certain extent. So these are kind of summarized answers. Okay, so what I would do just to kind of complete that answer, we didn't have enough space on the slide, is I would say, so this demonstrates that if it is consistent with the vision, that we should be thinking beyond just the mission statement. We should be looking at the two of them. Okay, so hopefully that answers your question. In terms of the slides, so the slides are not downloadable in this case, so I don't want to disappoint people, but there's like over 100 slides, and it just, to be honest, like they're downloadable within the course as of today. So you know, there has to be an incentive to purchase the course. So I'm going to say the slides are not downloadable in this case. The pre-scene review ones are downloadable publicly. There's samples that are downloadable publicly, but these will not be downloadable publicly. But you can watch the video on playback. It will be uploaded straight away after this session, and you can watch as many times as you want. Okay, so you have my contact details there. So at every pause, I would basically just pull up my details here. If you're, like I said, if you're interested in the textbook that we sell, the course, whatever, please do reach out on WhatsApp. The phone number's up in the corner. As much as possible, please don't ring me, because some of you are based in time zones where it's just socially, I just can't, I don't know what they call it, unsociable hours. I just can't answer the call because it's like 3 or 4 in the morning, and that's happened a few times. So please do not call me, text me, and then we can talk. Okay, so okay, can we discuss about values and an answer in this question? Yeah, so as long as you relate it back to the mission. So as I said with the vision, it's important that you integrate at the end and you say, well, we should be looking beyond the mission statement. So that's what creates the relevancy to the mission there. That point should be included on the slides, but there just wasn't enough space because we had the mission up the top. But yes, you could, but you just have to relate it back to the core requirement there. So if you could do the same thing with the values, then yes. Okay, so yeah, okay, I'm going to get stuck into the next piece here. So the next piece is around core activity B. So core activity B is probably the worst of them. Okay, it's the one that people tend to perform the worst on. And you can see why as we go through the various different assessment outcomes. So the first assessment outcome, and just so you're aware, core activity B is evaluate business ecosystem and business environment, is I can select and apply suitable strategic analytical tools. So this one's fairly straightforward. The next one, I can conduct an analysis of stakeholder needs and recommend appropriate responses. I can recommend appropriate responses to changes in the business ecosystem. The next one here is I can recommend KPIs that encourage sound strategic management. This one hasn't been tested much ever, I think twice from memory. I can recommend responses to economic, political and currency risks. So this one causes the most amount of trouble for people. And those are all the different assessment outcomes. So you can see there it's the biggest one, tends to be pretty difficult. Some of the topics here, ecosystems, currency risk, political risk, economic risk, these are tricky. Okay, so this is an important one. So the first area that I think you should know is stakeholders, right? This is tested loads. It's pretty straightforward, but it's just important to go through. So the first way in which this could be tested is stakeholder analysis. And you may be given a question where you're asked to identify stakeholders associated with a certain problem, an event, an issue, you may be asked to evaluate the impact of that issue on those stakeholders, or maybe you're asked to manage or how you should manage those stakeholders. So just be very careful with the way in which the question is phrased. So evaluation of impact, how does it impact them? Management, how do we deal with them? Two different things, okay? So very important that you read through the question very carefully. The next is an interesting one. So this came up in the most recent set of exams. Using stakeholder analysis to identify perpetrators of a cyber attack. So what we're looking at here is the relative level of interest for different parties and how much influence they have over the business. So if you have a cyber criminal, I suppose you could argue that they're highly interested in the business, but their ability to influence the business without the cyber attack is maybe limited. So the perpetrators would be ones who, possibly have a grievance with the business, and they're using the cyber attack in order to inflict damage on the business. So that kind of goes without saying, but we're using stakeholder analysis in that. Okay, so we're thinking about interest and power, or influence, as we said. The next is fringe groups. So we're talking here about small stakeholders. So very, very, very small stakeholders, kind of like, very small protest groups, something like that. Do we recognize them, and what are the implications of not recognizing them? So this has come up before. There was a scenario based on, if you're in the UK, maybe you've heard of Just Stop Oil. Effectively, it was based on that protester group, okay? So they were causing damage, and there was a question as to whether we should recognize them. So yes, if we recognize them, it allows us to, have a management strategy for them, which is important because they may gain power over time, so that is a consideration. However, if you recognize an illegitimate stakeholder, you may be giving them unnecessary credibility. So if they have, for example, caused criminal damage, and we're saying, yeah, this is a stakeholder we need to deal with, you may be giving them too much credibility. So you need to be very careful about that. The next thing is political risk. This has been tested way more in recent years than it ever has been. So I think this is an important one for Leother. The drivers of political risk. So what increases political risk? Generally speaking, it's when we act in a way that would, for lack of a better term, annoy the government. So if you increase the amount of emissions that you have, if you cause congestion in infrastructure, if you don't pay taxes, those are going to be drivers of political risk. Evaluating political risk. So these are the potential consequences that you could have as a result of having a negative relationship with the government. So penalties, fines, a lack of preference when we're talking about government contracts, or just being banned from bidding on government contracts altogether. That wouldn't really be something that would be super common, but these are things just to think of, okay? Tax investigations. Now, this one, it comes up every now and again, right? So tax investigations as a weapon, but of course we assume that the business is paying its taxes correctly. So is this one to worry about? Probably not, okay? The most important one there is probably government contracts. When we think about a business like Leother, it probably survives off of, government contracts, space agencies, which are generally speaking funded by the government. So that's an important one, a lack of preference. So managing political risk, how do we go about this? This came up quite recently, actually. So how do you deal with political risk? Typically, you engage with the government. This is the most simple, straightforward way. You deal with the issue that the government is presenting, okay? So if, for example, maybe we had a government contract, we didn't fulfill it, maybe we need to engage with the government and say, okay, we're going to make a compensation payment. Another way to do this is to build publicity, okay? So build positive publicity with the public. Now, remember, in a democracy, the government is elected by the people. So if you have a very positive public image, it's going to be very difficult for the government to, punish you very heavily, because it's going to affect them, right? So they don't want to be seen as kind of punishing a business that's popular, okay? That's something to bear in mind. Partnerships is another one. So if you enter into a partnership with the government, they're going to be less likely to be heavy-handed with the business, because they may be kind of intertwined on certain projects, okay? So currency risk is a big one, and this is one that I think everyone should just be really careful with. It's one that is tested very regularly, and typically the answers are pretty poor, okay? So evaluating currency risk, what we're talking about here is thinking about the exposure to currency risk and what that looks like effectively. So how do we evaluate that? How do we assess how much currency risk there is? Okay, so fluctuating currencies, how important is this? How material is this? How do we go about it? One way is to look at past data. Now, past data is not always indicative of what will happen in the future. And, if there was ever a time, I suppose, to maybe to show this in real life, it would be around 2007, okay, 2008. We had this big recession. And if we look at past data, that didn't predict that, okay? But to a certain extent, it can show maybe a lack of volatility over a certain period of time. That would give maybe a company a bit of safety, I suppose, in dealing with that currency, okay? So if there's been stability over many years, averaging out all these different cyclical events, you would assume that there is a certain degree of safety when we're dealing with that currency. So it will show some degree of currency risk, and it gives us some information to work with. Now, expert analysis can also be used. You can use the services of an investment bank. You can use specialized brokers that give information on currency risk. And also, if you look at central bank data, they can also be useful for predicting currency movements and then evaluating currency risk. Interest rates is another way in which we can evaluate currency risk. So you'll probably be familiar from the syllabus with the international Fisher effect. So just putting this really simply, how this effect works is if, for example, you have two countries, so let's just use a simplified example, the country with the higher interest rate will see its currency depreciate relative to the other currency belonging to the other country. And the reason why is because the effect basically assumes that if you have a higher interest rate, you have a higher inflation rate, therefore your currency is worth less over time. Okay, so there's many more details associated with that, but that's a simplified explanation of the international Fisher effect. Is it super useful in the long run? Yes, to an extent, but in the short term, definitely not. Okay, so the international Fisher effect is it suffers from many issues, the biggest one being oversimplification, especially in the short term, but it is something that you can use, okay, in order to predict long-term interest rate movements. Okay, hedging tools is another one. So you can actually get quotes for hedging tools, and this will give you an indicative idea of where currency rates will move in the future. Okay, so if you, for example, go to the markets, you arrange for a forward or something like that, you will basically get an expectation there of where the currency is going to move in the future. Okay, so the management of currency risk is very different. Okay, so evaluating currency risk, one side of the coin, managing currency risk, the other side of the coin. So how do we manage currency risk? Well, I recommend in your exam that you make sure that and this is so important, your treatment is specific to the scenario. Okay, don't just list off random tools. Make sure that your treatment is very specific to the scenario. So one of the ways in which we can actually deal with currency risk that many people don't use in their answers, which is a really good one, is acceptance. Okay, so in some circumstances, it makes sense just to accept the risk. If we're, for example, looking at a cybersecurity contract and we need to, get viruses removed, and it's really important that we do that, then we can just accept it. Okay, we can think about the currency risk at a later time. Maybe it's more important that we just get this service. Okay, sometimes as well, if the volatility is really low, maybe we just accept it. Okay, so internal hedging tools, so we can use things like invoicing and home currency, leading and lagging. Those are kind of tools that we can use there. External hedging tools, so we have the kind of the standard lot, forwards, futures, money market hedges, options. What I recommend, because futures tend to cause problems for people and the money market hedge as well, what I recommend is options and forwards are pretty simple. So just remember those, okay? Yes, you can remember the other ones if you want, but generally speaking, those would get you by because you can use the internal tools as well. You can use acceptance as well. So within all of those, you'll probably have enough to answer a question. Okay, so interest rate risk is another one. Okay, really important here. I think it could be tested for this upcoming paper. It hasn't really been tested loads in the SCS. I think it's probably people's most dreaded topic, although ecosystems is a close second. So it's important just to be aware of. I think if you were to get a question on it, the question wouldn't be super advanced, but you never know. So you may get a question about the impact of an increase in interest rates. So how would that affect the business? So the first answer everyone will give is, well, if we have variable rated debt, it will increase finance costs. And that is an important answer. It's a correct answer, but we need to think beyond that. So if you have an increase in interest rates, you'll also probably have an impact on demand. Because if you think about a satellite's a big thing, okay? It's a capital investment more than likely for a customer. So they may have to raise debt. And if they have to raise debt in order to purchase a satellite, then it's going to be an issue if interest rates are increasing. So it may affect demand. It may also increase risk. Okay, so it may be the case that we have customers, they have debt as well. Maybe their interest rates increases maybe the cost that they have, and as a result, they might become insolvent in the worst case scenario. Okay, so they may end up cancelling their orders as a result. business model adaptations. So it could be the case for this business, Leotair, that if interest rates keep on increasing, they may move into different business models. Now, this is a bit far-fetched, but they could move into, as we said, satellite data as a service, selling the data rather than the satellites, because that's a much cheaper option for customers. And if pricing is an issue with satellites, then actually we can sell the main value piece of that satellite, which is the data that's being generated. So maybe an adaptation to our business model. Okay, that could be one way in which the increasing interest rates would affect us. So just to note here that we have the impact of an increase. You could maybe have the impact of a decrease as well, although maybe not as likely. Okay, but just note that. So the management of interest rate risk, this has not really been tested ever, even though it is a topic that people dread. If you've ever sat the F3 exam, the OT exam, you'll know that the interest rate piece is really, really, really tricky. It certainly was when I did it. And on the FLP, the competencies are really tricky on this as well. So, what information do we need in the exam? So if you're managing interest rate risk, it's just like currency risk. There may be some situations where simply just accepting it is sufficient. Another strategy that's really useful to use in your answers is swaps. Okay, so swapping fixed for floating, floating for fixed. The reason why is because swaps are very flexible and they can be very long term. So they can be extended out to, tops 30 years, which may be relevant in an exam because the other tools are very short term in nature. Okay, so FRAs, IRGs, all these are pretty short term tools, right? So what I would suggest is just remember acceptance, which is really easy, and swaps. Okay, there are other hedging strategies. You can look at them, maybe an FRA. I don't know if it's going to be tested directly. Maybe just have one just in case you can maybe pull out an answer, but it's very short term. Okay, so I don't know if it really could be directly tested. Now, this one is a big one, ecosystems. This one causes people a lot of issues. So we're going to just spend a few minutes on this. So basically an ecosystem is a collection of partners or a collection of companies that are involved in the delivery of a product or service. Okay, so if we think about an ecosystem, let's say, okay, today I used Uber. Okay, so Uber is an example of a company that operates in the cab hailing ecosystem. So what partners do we have in the ecosystem? When I order my Uber with my Uber app, what partners are in the ecosystem? Well, the first is Apple and Google because they provide the platform for the app. Okay, so they're a part of the ecosystem. It wouldn't be possible to use Uber without them. You could argue that maybe the phone providers as well are within the ecosystem because I need my mobile phone in order to use the Uber app. Okay, so again, Apple is mentioned here, but maybe Samsung is also in the ecosystem to an extent. We also have the taxi drivers. They're within the ecosystem. We also have the regulators. So the regulator is always very active in this ecosystem, arguing that taxi drivers should be employees of Uber. Uber say that they should be independent contractors and so on and so forth. So those are the members of the ecosystem. There's loads more, but that just gives you an example. Okay, so all of the different parties involved in the delivery of that service, which is basically getting me into the city. Okay, so ecosystem impacts. Now, the way in which ecosystems tends to be tested is the introduction of new technology and how that will impact the ecosystem. Do I think ecosystems will be tested in this way for Leotair? I do. Okay, so the introduction of a new technology and then how that impacts the ecosystem. So you may have, for example, very low Earth orbit satellites, laser comm technology, possibly some new form of technology outside of those. How will this impact the ecosystem? Okay, possibly as well, maybe we look to launch a new service. So if, for example, we're looking to have this kind of data as a service, satellite data as a service, how will that impact the ecosystem? Okay, so that's again another consideration. Now, this question was examined in the last set of exams and it caused people a lot of issues. Challenges in understanding the ecosystem. Okay, so what are the difficulties in understanding the ecosystem? So think about Leotair, right? Many different components are pretty straightforward with the ecosystem. However, one major component that's a big tricky area is the role of a regulator. Okay, so when you think about things like satellites, it's in space. Now, space legislation is based on standards, global agreements, but there is no regulator necessarily of space. Okay, there's no space government necessarily that's going to fine you. So these things are typically managed at the UN level or at supranational levels like the EU or different blocks around the world. The United States has its own kind of set of standards for space, China as well. And the role of a regulator is very difficult to understand because there's kind of this global set of standards, and then we have local legislation, but that legislation is maybe underdeveloped because it's a new I suppose area for the country. So there's a kind of ambiguity there as to whether we should be abiding by the rules, these things like the Space Junk Charter. So that's a big piece in understanding the ecosystem, the challenge there. The next, in terms of managing the ecosystem, one of the biggest difficulties for managing the ecosystem for a company like Leotair is the fact that the demand for satellites is very sensitive to economic variables. Because if you have, for example, one of your biggest customers being the government or a space agency, if you have, let's say, turbulent economic conditions, this is the first kind of thing that's going to be cut in a government program, because it's not essential for the country. Okay, so it's very sensitive to economic variables, very sensitive to changes in governments and so on and so forth. So that can create a lot of issues in regards to managing the ecosystem. Okay, so analytical 2 is a little bit more straightforward here, so you can kind of take a breath. Okay, so pestel analysis, I'm sure we're all familiar with this. Basically, pestel analysis involves looking at various different factors in the external environment in order to kind of better understand that external environment. So you may be given a question around the usefulness of pestel analysis. Maybe you're given something like an event, and then you're asked to use pestel analysis in order to evaluate the impact of that event. So maybe a new piece of legislation, is released, and then we're asked, what are the social factors? What are the technological factors? What are the economic factors associated with this new legislation? Okay. Challenges in using pestel analysis. So that type of question hasn't really been examined before, but I think it could be. Really it will depend on the scenario. But if, for example, you're talking about things like social factors, these are very difficult to quantify. Okay, so that could be a major challenge, just as an example. Okay, with no context. The next one here is the SAF model. And this has been tested so many times, and it's everyone's favorite question. But just be very mindful. It can be tested in a way where you're not just using the framework. Okay, so you may be given questions where you have to use the model or the framework, suitability, acceptability, feasibility, but you may have questions around the challenges in applying it. Okay, and there's a temptation there for exam candidates just to rush into applying it, but actually you need to be very careful. Okay, be very, very, very discerning with the way in which the question has been phrased, because you may get challenges in applying it, which is very different to just applying it. You may also get the relevance of the SAF model. Okay, this came up in the most recent set of exams. How relevant are each of the various different components? There's 3. Okay, so they're very relevant if it's suitable, the course of action. It's very relevant if it's acceptable. It's very relevant if it's feasible. Okay, so let's look at some potential questions here. So the first is stakeholders. Okay, so recommend how stakeholder analysis might assist in the identification of perpetrators behind a cyber attack. So we kind of talked about that. We look at the interest, we look at the influence that they have. Okay, and it kind of narrows down who would be involved in the cyber attack. Now, in that particular question, I would just note that we need to be a little bit more technical than just using stakeholder analysis. Okay, so the next one here, identify 3 stakeholders interested in new rocket launch laws and evaluate the implications of these laws on each of them. Okay, so very straightforward question, and people tend to like these types of questions because it's very clear as to what you're being examined on here. So just make sure you read it very carefully. Okay, identify 3 stakeholders. Okay, so give 3. Okay, I know it seems like common sense, but just be really careful. There's a second part of it there that says evaluate the implications of these laws. Some people would miss that second part and then miss half the marks. Okay, so just be very mindful of that. Recommend how 3 stakeholders should be managed to encourage the government to build a new spaceport. So this one's a little bit different. It's about pushing stakeholders to do a certain action, and this has come up before in the past. And I'm just rushing through these, right? So I just want to make sure that we get through this within a reasonable period of time. So if I am talking quickly, just maybe use the video on the slower speed on the playback, because I just need to make sure that this doesn't run into crazy hours. Okay, so evaluate the political risks of a special satellite project within the with the Wexlandian government failing. Now this is an interesting question. So maybe we have a contract with the Wexlandian government and we're evaluating the political risks associated with it possibly failing. So we may have fines, we may have a lack of preference in terms of future government contracts. But a point to add here is that this government is not really going to be maybe too heavy-handed with the business, because Leotair is in space exploration, science, technology, and they don't want to be overly punitive with businesses like this where they're advancing the country's maybe national goals. Okay, so this is a consideration to have. This is kind of going beyond just the surface level points. Evaluate the forces that could drive political risks if an overseas spaceport is constructed. We kind of talked about this, emissions, infrastructure, congestion. Recommend how the political risks arising from a satellite collision could be managed. Okay, so how could we manage these risks We talk about it already. We said positive publicity, reaching out to the government, and so on. Currency risk. So evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of raising an overseas loan to fund the purchase of an overseas spaceport. This has been tested loads. Typically it's answered really badly. So I see CIMA testing this again. In terms of the strengths, it's one way in which we can manage translation risk. Okay. This is actually mentioned within the Pro Accountancy textbook, I believe several times. And there's actually a question on this within the book, to the best of my knowledge, which is pretty much the exact same. In terms of the weaknesses, one of the main weaknesses is that it may be the case that the interest rate is higher in that country. Okay, so it may be more expensive. It may be the case that it creates transaction risk. Okay, so it depends on the way in which the debt is set up. So recommend how currency risks associated with an overseas entity should be managed and evaluated. So really careful here with the verb. So evaluated. So we need to consider the evaluation of the currency risk. So we look at possibly the future trading patterns. So we need to see where is currency risk going to come from, how material is it going to be. So we would get information from experts. We would look at past data, those types of things, interest rate differentials. And in terms of managing the risk, in this case, if there's many transactions between the two entities, it may be the case that it's simply just an acceptance, okay, of this risk. There are different ways in which you can manage it that are a little bit more unorthodox, and this has actually come up before in the exams, where possibly you may stockpile. Sometimes companies do that, where they will purchase from one of their own entities, or maybe even just an external supplier, and they will stockpile in order to deal with currency risk. So when the currency is moving the right direction for them, they'll just buy a load of raw materials or components or whatever, and therefore they've taken advantage of a kind of a positive currency situation. So evaluate the arguments for and against switching a contract's currency to prevent its cancellation. This has never been tested before. I think this could maybe come up for Leotair in some shape or form. This type of question is very difficult. Okay, so in terms of switching a contract's currency, yes, it would manage the currency risk associated with it. It would bring it back into possibly our own currency. However, in terms of the points against it, it may be very difficult to convince the other party to do that. Okay, so it might not really be feasible. Interest rate risk. So discuss the challenges in evaluating the interest rate risk on a loan and recommend how they could be managed. Okay, so in terms of evaluating the interest rate risk on a loan, there's many different economic variables that affect interest rates, so it's very hard to predict in the future where interest rates will go. We can have one-off events, we can have recessions, we can have tariffs, we can have trade wars. They're going to all affect interest rates. Recommend how they could be managed, acceptance and swaps. Okay, so those are kind of the two ones I recommend. Evaluate the impact of rising interest rates in Wexland following the initiation of a large contract to construct a satellite. Okay, so in this case, again, think about things like we talked about already: the finance costs, demand, overall risk. Okay, so it creates risk for this project. Okay, so possibly in the future it may become unfeasible. Recommend whether a customer's withdrawal could have been prevented by looking at interest rate differentials. So the difference between the interest rate in the country we're in, which is Wexland, and the country in which the, in this case, is a customer, where they're based. Okay, so looking at the difference between the two. This is effectively testing you on the international Fisher effect without explicitly saying it. And in this case, you could say, yes, okay, we could have looked at these. This could have given us some signals as to where the currency rates were going to move. But of course, the withdrawal of a customer, there's many factors here. Okay, so it may not just be currency. Okay, it may be other factors. If we had a more attractive offering for them, they may have been willing to accept that risk. Okay, so there's many factors there that need to be considered. Okay, so ecosystems, we talked about some of these questions already. Actually, evaluate the impact that the implementation of LaserCom will have on the business ecosystem of Leotair. Really what we should be thinking about here are the different parties within the ecosystem. So if you have this new laser communication technology, one of the biggest changes that will happen in the ecosystem is that we will now have to have ground stations that are basically accepting this laser technology. So that'll change the ground stations. You also need to consider the businesses like Leotair, its competitors. They're going to race to implement this technology if it's significantly better. So you will have a period of time where we'll have satellites that have radio frequency and laser communication. Therefore, the ground stations have to accept both. You will have suppliers of this laser technology being very important within the ecosystem. They will enter. There's a risk for existing suppliers that they'll become obsolete. Loads of different changes there. Evaluate the challenges in understanding and managing the ecosystem in which Leother operates. Okay, so we talked about this already. It was a really tough question that came up in the most recent set of exams. Evaluate the strategic impact on Leother's business ecosystem of the implementation of space junk regulations. So this is where they're formally signed in as regulations. I suppose the biggest impact is that it would change the designs, so therefore it may have an impact on the suppliers of components that are required in order to possibly deorbit the satellites within a certain period of time, and so on and so forth. It would also affect the launch providers. Okay, so the analytical tools. So recommend if more frequent pestle analysis could have prevented a client's order cancellation. Yes, to an extent, just looking at this at a surface level, yes, if we're looking at external factors, it may help us to predict that we're going to have a client cancelling their order, maybe partway through or just before they even place the order. However, there's limitations here, because looking at external factors is one thing, but there's many different factors that go into a customer's order. So yes, to an extent is the answer there. Discuss the challenges when using the SAF model to evaluate a strategy to acquire an overseas spaceport. This is a very standard question for the SAF model, kind of an adaptation question, but it has kind of come up before. In terms of the challenges, it would really depend on the circumstances. Okay, so maybe it's difficult to ascertain the risk. Maybe it's something that we've never done before. In terms of suitability, maybe there's a cannibalization effect if it's something like maybe launching like a data service just outside of the scope of this question. So it'll depend on the circumstances there. Evaluate the relevance of the SAF criteria when deciding whether to make voluntary sustainability disclosures. This came up in the most recent set of exams. And really what we're talking about here is if the action of making the sustainability disclosures is in alignment with the suitability, acceptability and feasibility, then they become relevant. Okay, so is it the case that making these disclosures is suitable? Okay, does this have a strategic fit with the organization? Then yes, then suitability is relevant. It's a really tricky way of examining the SAF framework. Okay, so let's look at a worked example here. So North Grain is a large wheat farming company based in the country of Northland. At the start of the year, Leother entered into a contract to construct 3 satellites for North Grain. The contract was denominated in N dollars, the currency used in Northland, which is a semi-developed country. Now this is a really important piece here. This theme of developed country, semi-developed country, this has come up before, okay, within the reference materials. It was agreed that the contract would be paid in 3 stages, with the first stage being complete soon. Now, a new political party has been elected in Northland, causing the N dollar to weaken in strength relative to the W dollar. Evaluate the challenges involved in managing the currency risk associated with the North Grain contract. Now, this is a really horrible question for currency risk, and this is why I've included it. Just to be honest, it would have been really easy for me to just have like a really simple question that we could go through. But I thought I would give you an example of a really tough question. Okay, so this one, you have to really read through it carefully. Evaluate the challenges involved in managing the currency risk associated with the North Grain contract. So it's asking you, what makes this so difficult to manage in terms of currency risk? Okay, so let's look at, as I said, 5 paragraphs, but if you have 4, you could still get really good marks here. So timing is the first. So the nature of the contract is that we have 3 stages. And these stages are going to likely be based on the completion of the satellite. And this is based on the pre-seen information where it kind of suggests this. As a result, it's going to be difficult to determine an appropriate hedging strategy because the timing of the receipt is uncertain. Okay, so if we have something like a forward contract that locks us into a specific date, it could be very difficult to use that as a hedging strategy because we don't necessarily know when the receipt will come in. Okay, so if, for example, we had maybe arranged for a forward contract, there's complications in production, then we're going to still have that forward contract arranged, fixed into a certain date, but the receipt isn't there. Okay, so it's kind of complicated in that sense. The next is clients. So one way in which you can manage currency risk is to switch this, as we kind of mentioned before, to the W dollar. Okay, so maybe a renegotiation. But the issue with this is that the customer is likely to find at this moment in time the W dollar equivalent to be higher, and therefore why would they agree to this? Okay, it may be very difficult to come up with an equivalent value in W dollars that they're going to find acceptable. Okay, so we may make a loss if we kind of price it under what it is in equivalent terms, but they may not accept a higher value, which we have at the moment. So it creates a bit of a difficult situation. Even though this is a strategy that we could use, it's unlikely that they're going to accept this. Okay. The next then is acceptance. So one way in which you can typically manage currency risk, as we said, is through just simply accepting it. But in this case, we can't really do that because the contract's likely to be material given that it's for 3 satellites, and if we have no hedging action being taken, the satellites may become unprofitable over time. So it's very material. It's not something that we can just necessarily leave and just hope for the best. It's possibly something that we do have to take action into because it will eat into profits, but also it creates a situation where we're working on satellites, we have limited operational capacity that are unprofitable for the business, and therefore that comes at an opportunity cost because we could be working on more profitable satellites. So the nature of the business, and this is great pre-scene application here, is such that we can't necessarily just cancel because of the reputation effects, the fact that we only have limited customers, and really when you think about satellites, there's only a limited market out there for them anyways. Okay, so we may only have a limited number of customers, but there are really only a limited number of customers out there because satellites are quite a niche thing. The next is the nature of the risk. So it appears that the weakness in the end dollar is coming from the election, this new party, and it can be difficult to determine if this is going to be a long-term development or just kind of a short-term reaction to this election. Okay, so we don't know if, for example, we were to engage in hedging actions, that those may be redundant because this is just a short-term impact. We don't know if this is a long-term or a short-term impact. It may be the case that the actions of the new party actually cause permanent weakening to the currency. Sometimes governments will do that. They will actually go out of their way to do that. There's reasons for that. The opposite may be true as well. So the uncertainty over the permanence of this movement makes it very difficult to manage, makes it difficult to know whether we should hedge it, whether the cost of hedging is actually worth the risk. Okay, so range of hedging options in this case. Now this is kind of it's like a supplementary point. It's not a brilliant one, but it is one that you can use. So the range of hedging options may be limited in this case because it's a semi-developing economy. Okay, so what we're saying here is that a standardized exchange, they may not actually provide standard hedging tools for this particular currency. It may be thinly traded, which is the term that's used sometimes where there isn't many market participants that are buying and selling this, so it wouldn't be worth their while creating, futures and other types of kind of standardized tools. It may also be too risky as well. Okay, so that's possibly a reason why it's thinly traded. Internal hedging techniques, we can say some of them may be redundant. Matching, for example, if we don't actually deal with the end dollar elsewhere, it's not really that useful. Leading and lagging mightn't be feasible if, for example, they're working to kind of their own cash flow schedule where they say, actually, we're not going to just pay you when you want, in terms of leading and lagging. We're going to stick to our own schedule for cash flow reasons. And over-the-counter hedging tools, important just to note here, they would still be relevant. Okay, so even though we've kind of said, right, all these tools, these are not useful, let's be reasonable here. Yes, we could still use OTC tools, okay, which are kind of flexible tools. Okay, so this is just a bit of a pause. Now these pauses are for me. They're for me to just catch my breath a bit because we're going through this quite quickly here and just to get a bit of water. Now I can see the attendance is massive, which is fantastic. And thank you so much everyone for joining. It really means a lot to me. 100 people is fantastic for YouTube Live, and of course this will be uploaded straight away after, and you can see the playback of the comments. Okay, so that's just something to be aware of. When you're watching the video on YouTube, you can click play live relay and it'll give you the comments if there's something that you asked and you want to skip to it. I'll try as well to add the shortcuts on the YouTube videos. You can go through each core activity. Maybe there's one that you want to look at specifically. It should be in the comments. Okay, so just looking at some of the comments that you guys have made, the messages. So our customers may not buy satellites as they need to take out debt. Yeah, exactly. You're dead right. Stefan, you're dead right. So yeah, satellites are a big capital investment. You're right there. And that's a key consideration. Oh, it was from Ria. Thank you so much for Stefan for answering that question. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. You got it completely right. Taiwan interest basically affects spending behavior. Yep. Can lobbying be used as a way to manage political and economic risk? Taiwo, I think you've nailed it as good as I would, right? So political risk, yes, through influencing government policies. Exactly. Economic risk would be a stretch. Yeah, you're right. Economic risk would be a stretch there. To an extent, yeah, but I think for a company like Leotair, it's not big enough to make an impact like that. So I would suggest no in that case. Okay. So let's crack on with core activity C. Okay, so core activity C is pretty small. Okay, so the next few are a bit more kind of short, so we can kind of get through them a bit quicker. Okay, so let's go through core activity C. So core activity C looks like this: recommend financing strategies, and there's only 3 elements to it. So I can recommend suitable sources of finance, I can recommend dividend policy, and I can recommend and apply business valuation models. Okay, so in this case, I just want to flag something here, right? And this is why it's good to have someone like me, and I'm not just blowing my own trumpet, right? But you will see these three here, but there's a secret one, okay, which is share price movements. Okay, so share price movements are testable within core activity C and efficient market hypothesis, which is typically wrapped up within share price questions. Okay, so really important there. It's hard to relate these, I'll be honest, like I don't know which one it actually maps to, but share price movements tested so frequently, and it's related to core activity C. Okay, beta as well, you could argue it's within the business valuation models. That's also included within core activity C, which everyone is probably thinking, Hugh, is beta going to be tested? It could be. Okay, we're going to talk about that. So share price and efficient market hypothesis. So evaluating the impact on share price. So this is a very common question within the SCS. Evaluate XYZ and its impact on the share price. Now, when you get questions like this, this is the approach that I would use. Is this event going to affect the company's future cash flows? If it's a yes, then it's probably going to affect the company's share price. If it's a no, probably not. Okay, so those are the things that you need to consider. And actually, this came up in the most recent set of CIMA exam solutions where they actually mentioned this. Okay, so think about the projection of future cash flows. Is it going to affect that or is it not? Okay, and also think about this in the short term and the long term. So in the short term, we can assume for Leotard that there's a semi-efficient market, which basically means that when new information is released into the market, it's going to affect the share price of the business. Okay, this new information, if it's relevant to the business and if it relates to the business, having a future cash flow impact, then it's going to affect the share price. We need to think about the short term first. So when we have this release of new information, it's likely the case that we will have this increase or decrease, again, depending on the nature of the information. But this will be exaggerated to a certain extent by short-term volatility. So you may have, for example, traders, professional traders in the market that profit from the volatility of the shares. And when I say volatility, I just mean the shares going up and down in value. And people make short-term profits off this. Professional traders make short-term profits off this. And this then has an effect on the way in which our share price goes up and down effectively. So in the short term, you will have this noise, as it's called, where you have short-term volatility of short-term trading going on. You may have other things going on in the markets as well that day, which may impact on a short-term basis. But then in the long term, we're looking more at that fundamental question. Does this increase our ability to generate cash flows or not? Okay, and that's something that we need to bear in mind when we get questions around whether this impacts the share price or not, because I can't tell you the amount of scenarios that will come up around this. Sometimes you can get really bizarre, random scenarios. Just think about those fundamental rules and hopefully those will help you. Now, you may get questions that are a little bit different around share price movement. So you may be given a question around interpreting a share price movement. So there's a share price decrease. Why is that? Interpret that. So for example, let's say we have an acquisition scenario where maybe we look to acquire another business and both of them are listed and both share prices decrease when there's an announcement of this acquisition. Okay, what does that mean? How do we interpret that? Well, the markets in this case believe that this is not going to generate future cash flows. Actually, this acquisition is probably going to destroy shareholder value. So it's a negative reaction. So this is again an interpretation of the situation. Possibly the markets believe that synergies are not going to be realized. That doesn't really make strategic sense. The cultures are different, okay? The integration process would be a failure. So that's an interpretation of share price movements. You may get a question around the relevance and implications of share price movements. Kind of the same thing, okay? So the relevance, why is it important to share price movement? Now, this is something that's typically answered quite badly, right? So sometimes people will say, oh, it's going to affect our profits, or it's going to affect the cash flows of the business. But the share price moving is not really going to affect profits, not really going to affect cash flows. So that's something just to bear in mind that has come up before in the past, and it kind of tricked people up a little bit, okay? So the relevance here when we think about the share price, it's going to be relevant for the board, because if the share price goes down and down and down and down, likely they will lose their jobs, and it's going to affect their personal remuneration if they have, share options or stock, just general stock in the business. In terms of relevance as well for the shareholders, it's going to affect them. personally, their personal wealth. So these are things we need to consider in terms of relevance. It will also affect the business, and this is an implication, a consequence, if we're looking to acquire other businesses using share exchanges. If the shares go down in value, that's going to give us less leverage to purchase those businesses. We have to issue more shares, that's going to cause more dilution. Okay, it's less feasible. So those are things to consider. Now, the next style of question has come up several different times, and there's two ways in which it can be examined. So protecting the share price if negative information is released into the markets. So something bad happens, let's say, for example, a collision of one of our satellites. How do we protect our share price? How do we manage the share price so that it doesn't go down as much as it would have otherwise? And then the other style of question is, how do we incorporate positive news, positive developments into our share price? So basically the same type of question, one's just looking at the negative, one's looking at the positive. The answer is pretty much the same. So we make sure that we release positive information into the markets, okay? So if we're looking to protect our share price, we respond to it, we have a press release possibly, we engage with market analysts, we show that we're going to make a tangible difference that will prevent this from occurring again. We do not come across as cynical, as in we're not just releasing this statement to keep everyone happy and that it comes across disingenuous. Actually, we have a tangible plan that was, is realistic, okay, that's going to address this issue. If it's a collision, okay, we're going to have extra testing, we're going to use new materials, we're going to get training. Okay, realistic actions. Incorporating positive information is the same thing. So press releases, market analysts, disclosures in our annual report. So these are the external ways in which we communicate this positive news. Market analysts, so this has come up before. It's kind of a weird question where you're asked whether you should pursue a strategy based on the advice of a market analyst. Now, it's such a random question, right? But these things can come up. So a market analyst is basically someone who typically works for an investment bank. Now, this is very generalized. If you work in an investment bank, don't shout at me. Basically, they work in an investment bank and they give recommendations on buying and selling equities. Okay, so they do research and they say to their clients, you know what, you're a big hedge fund, you should buy this, you should sell this, or you're a big rich individual, this is what you should do with your money. So we can brief them. As a business, you can actually reach out to market analysts in these big companies. You can say, this is what we're doing as a business. This is what I used to do in my job. And you can basically say, this is the positive things that we're doing. We're building this number of stores. We're introducing this product. Look at all the amazing things that we're doing. And that then will influence their buy or sell recommendations, which can have an effect on the share price. Okay, so sources of finance. Now, this is a very straightforward area. Typically, people are really well prepared for this question, so we won't spend loads of time on it, but it's very heavily tested. And the first way in which it can be tested is acquisition finance. So funding the purchase of a business. We can use debt. We can use a share exchange. We can use an earnout. Now, earnouts have never been tested before. I believe they will be tested someday. I have been testing them for about 3 years in mock papers, and they're still to appear in the exam. Basically, an earnout is a situation where you have an agreement between the buyer and the seller where a certain part of the consideration is contingent upon the achievement of specific goals and targets. So basically what you say is, well, okay, if you believe that you're going to make 2 million next year, if we do make 2 million, I will give you 500,000 as part of this transaction. Okay, so it's a great way of bridging what they call a valuation gap. So if the buyer and seller disagree about the valuation, they can create an earnout that basically fills in that gap. Okay, that says, actually, if you do all this stuff, I will give you the consideration that you're looking for. So it de-risks the entire transaction. Financing projects. So if we're looking to fund just a project or a construction or something like that outside of an acquisition, we have debt, we have rights issues, and we also have this new one that has come into the exam a lot more now, suspending dividends. Now in this case, dividends are not a significant portion of our most recent set of profits. So is suspending dividends likely in this case? Probably not, okay, but it may come up. Okay, other issues. So you may have other issues, things like covenants. So debt covenants are basically rules that you have to stick to when you get debt. There's different types of covenants. Sometimes you can have ones around the amount of dividends you can pay. Sometimes around the maintenance of assets. Sometimes you have ones around the amount of gearing you can have in a business. That's probably the most common one. So if we have these covenants, how do we overcome them? That has been a question before in the past. And you may have questions around structuring. Now, this one's less common. There was like a wave where CIMA loved testing this. It hasn't really come up much in recent years, but maybe you might get a question around whether it's advantageous to, raise debt in one go, or whether we should raise debt as we go with a certain project, something like that. Okay, this is kind of made up on the spot, but those questions were very specific to the pre-scenes that they were tested on. Dividend policy is the next one. So sustaining dividends. This has come up before in the past. So if we have a situation where it looks like our profits are declining, maybe there's been a situation where maybe there's been a cancellation, something like that, of a contract, or maybe there's been issues for the business, and it looks as if we're actually not going to meet our dividend targets. Do we warn the markets now, or do we warn them, or do we wait and just see what happens, and then eventually when we pay our dividends, they'll go, okay, well, this is an issue. Okay, we have insufficient dividends. So there's different answers to that question. When you warn markets in advance, obviously it's going to have a negative effect on the share price, but it braces the markets for the eventual issue where we have actual reduced dividends because of a lack of profitability. However, if you maybe wait, you may actually have a reversal of the profitability situation. So it may cause unnecessary volatility. So changing policies, this has kind of come up before in the past. So you may have a change in dividend policy in response to, let's say we're investing in research and development. Maybe we're researching into the development of a new type of satellite, something like that. Would we change our dividend policies so that we retain the cash, and possibly that's a way in which we could fund it. For acquisition, so maybe we've acquired a business and we're looking to change their dividend policy and how their shareholders would react to the existing Leoter dividend policy. This question has been tested in the past, and actually it's quite an interesting question because there could be adaptations of this where Leoter is acquired and now it has a different dividend policy that its acquiring company is using, and therefore we have to talk about the reaction possibly of shareholders to that new policy. Now, it's hard to answer that question without seeing the policy. The implications of share repurchases. So where we go into the markets and we actually purchase our own shares. Generally speaking, it's seen as a way to increase the company's share price because you have less shares in issue. It tends to increase the share price. It's a kind of controversial subject, okay? So in some countries, for certain years of certain countries, the United States being the most sort of prevalent example, it was actually illegal in the United States for many years. Share repurchases are controversial because they're not necessarily a very productive use of capital, okay? So it can signal to markets that we've ran out of ideas effectively for deploying capital, but it does tend to deliver returns for shareholders, and it can be a way to boost your share price. Large bonuses, so large bonus dividends can be a great way to deliver returns back to shareholders, but it can create an expectation that this bonus will occur every single year, which is a bad expectation to create. Scrip dividends. So scrip dividends are basically where we pay shares instead of cash dividends. Okay, so one of the biggest benefits is that we retain cash. But one of the drawbacks is that in this particular case, we think about Leoter, our shares are not really worth that much, okay, and they're actually declining in value. So our shareholders may not be happy with that. So business valuations, this one causes people issues. It's actually not that complicated for the SCS. It is a bit more complicated for the competencies and the OT within F3 or financial strategy. So the first type of question, deriving a purchase price. Okay, so we're asked, how do we come up with a purchase price for a specific business? We need to negotiate typically. So there is no set price that we should come up with if we're looking to acquire a business. It's a negotiation where we have a spectrum of valuations. So we come up with multiple different valuations and we use our different valuation techniques to come up with them, and eventually we negotiate a price. So we should know the minimum and the maximum, and then we negotiate within those. So the methodologies for finding those different valuations, we have the asset-based methodology where basically you're looking at the company's assets, okay, so assets minus liabilities. And there's different ways in which you can do this. So you can look at assets from the perspective of book values. You can look at them from net realizable values. You can look at them from replacement values. So this is kind of a very basic technique. Doesn't really give us a very accurate reading of the company's valuation, but if the business is very asset heavy, it would give us some indication of the value of the business, but it doesn't really take into consideration the time value of money or cash flows or anything like that. Dividend-based valuation methods use the dividend stream of the business, so it kind of discounts it, and it looks at that stream in the future and says, okay, what's it going to be in perpetuity, and then we get a valuation based on that dividend. Now, this type of methodology is very useful for valuing minority shares or minority stakes in businesses, but it's not very good when the business doesn't pay a dividend, which many businesses don't. So, if the business doesn't pay a dividend, which very often is the case in the exam where the business is maybe a startup or a loss-making business, something like that. These wouldn't really be that relevant. Earnings based, so this is where we use the company's earnings, which are basically the profits of the business, and they're adjusted for how we're expecting to run the organization, so you can make some adjustments to it. And then what we do is we multiply it by the industry's price earnings ratio, and this is what they call a multiplier. Now, the multiplier is very arbitrary. Okay, you might be thinking, why do we do that? It's really like an industry standard sort of action to take. There's not much science to it, right? It's just like something that people tend to do. This is one of the major drawbacks with earnings-based methodologies, is that they use multipliers that don't really have much grounding in the valuation of the business. Okay, so again, industry standard, multipliers a little bit arbitrary. Cash flow based models tend to be the most accurate, where we project out the cash flows, the free cash flows of the business, and then we discount them using the WACC and we deduct off debt. That's the cash flow based methodology. Really complicated compared to the other ones, because we have to project out those cash flows and see what are we going to do in year 2, year 3, year 4, and then into perpetuity. So really quite a well used model within industry, something that people do actually rely upon day to day, and tends to be kind of the most used out of these 4. So we may have questions around challenges in valuing businesses. So you may be given a kind of, I suppose there's no nice way of saying it, a kind of a lame business, right? So the business is like loss making, it's a bit of a mess, and you're asked, what are the challenges in valuing this business? So maybe the business is, like I said, loss making, so earnings based methodologies wouldn't be useful. As a result, dividends based methodologies wouldn't really be useful, because if it's making a loss, is it paying a dividend? Probably not. Okay, in some cases that can actually be illegal if you don't have the sufficient amount of retained earnings. An asset-based methodology, well, if the business is, say, a startup or maybe a software business or a service business, it won't really have many assets to use to value the business. And cash flow based tends to be the most appropriate, but again, there's challenges with this, because if you're looking to repurpose the business, so maybe you're acquiring it, inserting it into the group, it's going to have a different set of cash flows as a result of that repurpose. So something just to bear in mind, it might be difficult to project the cash flows. Okay, so that's something there. Now the beta is really important, right? This has been tested in the most recent set of exams, and it caused people a lot of problems. Now we have tested beta in my career, right? I've tested beta every single round, because it's something that people tend to have issues with, and it's better to deal with it now than to deal with it on exam day. So basically it's a measure of relative systematic risk, okay? And the relevance of it, so this is the important bit. A beta of 1 means that the company's shares are as volatile as the market. We probably know this. Beta more than 1 more volatile than the market. This is the case for Leoter. Beta less than 1 less volatile than the market. And then we have the composition of beta. So this is really important, this last piece here. So beta is composed of 2 elements for an organization that has debt, okay? If the organization doesn't have debt, it's just business risk. But if the business has debt, like Leoter, long-term debt, it's composed of 2 elements, and this can be really useful for questions. So business risk, which is the risk associated with the company's operations, and finance risk, which is related to how much debt is in the organization's capital structure. And as you increase those risks, you increase the company's beta, and the opposite is true as well. So when you're given questions around, will this affect beta, think about those 2 elements. So if you have a question that says, what's the impact on beta of this action, maybe an acquisition, okay, we need to think about whether this creates more finance risk or less finance risk, more business risk or less business risk, okay? And that will then determine. Now, the last one here is something that some of you who are repeating will be familiar with, and this came up in the most recent set of exams. Currency movements were tested. So, is currency going to affect, or currency movements, is that going to affect our beta? Let's think about it, okay? So in the case of business risk, do currency movements really affect our operations? Not really, okay? And remember that you can always hedge these risks, okay? So not really related to business risk necessarily. Now, finance risk, I don't want to go too far into detail on this, but for Leoter, not really, because it doesn't have any overseas subsidiaries. Now, in the case of the last exam, it did have overseas subsidiaries, which can create a change in finance risk due to currency movements, but it's not really relevant for Leoter, so I'm not going to go into detail on it. I don't want to confuse people. So let's look at potential questions. So share price and efficient market hypothesis, the first one. So evaluate the impact on Leoter's share price of failing to make voluntary sustainability disclosures. So this came up in the most recent set of exams. I've just taken the question word for word. Basically, this type of question, we really need to think about this cash flow rule that I said. Okay, so yes, if we don't make these disclosures, will it have an effect on the share price? To an extent it will, because if you don't make these disclosures, there is an increased risk of protester groups causing disruption, and maybe the scenario actually gives you that information. And so that's something you could incorporate and say, yes, it will actually, because if we have this heightened risk of disruption operationally, possibly that's going to affect cash flows. But if that isn't a factor, then no. Okay, and you can be kind of comfortable saying that when you use that rule around cash flows. Recommend ways in which Leotair could protect its share price following a collision involving one of its satellites. We actually talked about that nearly word for word. Recommend whether the board should acquire a competitor based on a market analyst's advice. So yes, to an extent we should, because they have lots of information that they're getting from different sources. Their day-to-day job is research, and so yes, they would have an informed opinion, but it shouldn't be the only source that we use when we make big decisions like that. Okay, so the next tier for sources of finance: evaluate the arguments for and against the use of an earn-out arrangement. So when we're using an earn-out arrangement to acquire a business, in this case, a satellite component company, an earn-out arrangement is a great way to bridge, as I said, a valuation gap. It's a great way to retain, top staff, the CEO of the business that we acquired, possibly other executives. However, it can encourage short-term behavior, because if they're looking to achieve their targets, they may do anything, maybe at the detriment of the long-term performance of the business in order to get those targets achieved. Recommend the factors that should be considered before using a rights issue to purchase a supplementary workshop. How much information do we disclose? What's the discount that we should be applying to our shares? Do we use an underwriter? Recommend the methods that could be used to raise debt despite there being existing debt covenants tied to gearing. What we need to consider there really is possibly refinancing, maybe negotiating with the bank, possibly not paying dividends. Those are types of techniques that we can use. Evaluate the implications of using a windfall gain to make a partial share repurchase. We talked about this, share price increase. Possibly then speculation about the board's competence. Are they running out of ideas? For a business like Leotair, this wouldn't really be a good use of capital. Okay, we could be investing this into developing technology, moving into new industries, possibly, as I said, moving into satellite data as a service, that kind of thing, laser comm technology. Discuss the arguments for and against retaining dividends to fund the development of VLEO satellites. So these are very low Earth orbit satellites. These are real world satellites that tend to have sort of more accurate photography because they're closer to Earth, so the transmission distance is a lot lower. The arguments for and against in terms of retaining dividends, I suppose the argument for is that it keeps cash in the business, so that could be a good thing. Arguments against is that we would be effectively changing our dividend policy, and that will have an effect on our existing set of shareholders that would expect a certain amount of dividends, because we would probably have a pattern of paying dividends, and if we're not meeting that pattern, that consistency, they're probably going to sell their shares and search for a company that does meet their need for that consistency or their preferences. So evaluate the arguments for and against, immediately warning that dividend expectations will not be met. That's something that we talked about. Okay. Evaluate the challenges involved in valuing an innovative startup that creates laser comm technologies for satellites. So again, it's kind of a weird business, hard to value. We talked about the fact that for a company like this that is innovative, it's a startup technology business, maybe it doesn't really have many tangible assets that we can use for the asset-based method. It likely doesn't have dividends. These types of businesses don't typically pay dividends, so that wouldn't be appropriate. For the earnings-based, they may not be profitable. For the cash flow based model, it may be very difficult to actually project out the cash flows. Maybe we're expecting rapid growth, and it can be very difficult to accurately project that out. Recommend the factors to be considered when acquiring a direct competitor as an acquisition target. So synergies would be a big one there. Possibly we could be looking at things like, even at a more strategic level, possible interference from competition authorities. So if we have a monopoly, that could maybe be something that we could consider more from a core activity A perspective. Evaluate the arguments for and against the use of a discounted cash flow model to value a VLEO satellite manufacturer. If you're a customer of mine, we actually have a question on this within the Ultimate SCS textbook. So basically, just to give you a very quick idea on this, the main benefit, I suppose, or the main argument for of using this model is that it tends to be a very a good way of inserting assumptions into the valuation. So we can look at, say, year 3, we can insert what we think we're going to do with the business, possible inflows, outflows. Whereas the other methodologies, it's hard to do that. We can actually year by year plan out what we're going to do with the business and factor that into the valuation. Now, one of the drawbacks of this valuation methodology is that it's very difficult to accurately project the cash flows, especially for a business that's dynamic, a new business, or one that maybe we're going to repurpose. It's going to have a different purpose within the organization. Okay, so we talked about this with beta. Explain whether Leotair's exposure to currency risk is likely to impact its beta coefficient. If you need more information on that one, look at variant 6 of the most recent set of exam papers that were released on the CIMA website for the SCS. Evaluate if a sharp increase in share price following an acquisition announcement is consistent with Leotair's beta. This is a really tricky question. The answer there is not really. So basically what this is testing you on is your knowledge of beta. So even though we have a beta more than 1, in this particular case, if there was a sharp increase in the share price, it's because of this specific information. When we're talking about general movements, maybe, okay, so if there was a general movement in the market, okay, possibly we could maybe relate it back to this, but in this particular case, it's an acquisition announcement. So that would relate to the market's expectation about cash flows being generated in the future. Okay, so that's what we need to focus on in that particular case. So the answer there is not really. The beta is not really that relevant in that case. Evaluate the effect that an acquisition of an overseas spaceport would have on beta coefficient. And this is something that we talked about. Finance risk, business risk. Okay, so is it going to affect one of them? Will it affect the other one? What I would do in my answer really is separate the two out. Okay, so that's the best way of approaching this. Okay, so a worked example here. So an article has been published showing that Orbalink, one of Leotair's competitors, has released a new satellite body. The body contains laser communication technology, which allows for faster communication between satellites. We've been talking a lot about this. Leotair has been working on integrating this technology with its satellites, with it due to be ready in 6 months' time. In response to the news, Leotair's share price has dropped by 3% over the course of the day. In response, the board is proposing that Leotair change its dividend payout ratio to be 75% of profit, so a drastic change. And maybe this is a desperate attempt to change the trajectory of the share price. So evaluate the implications of Leotair's change in dividend policy worth 50%. So probably 4 to 5 paragraphs here. You hear me say normally 1 paragraph every 10%, but sometimes in the reality of the exam, it can be difficult to get 5 out of these types of questions. So 4 would be sufficient. You'd probably do very well if you had 4 very well written paragraphs here. So the first answer is on the clientele effect. So basically, we're using the pre-seen information here. So approximately 37% of the company's FY, so financial year 2025 profits would be paid out as dividends. The company's dividend policy, if it's consistent, it would attract a clientele of shareholders that would appreciate this. This is what they're looking for. That's why they've invested in the business. So they most likely appreciate some dividend with a big amount of retention there, possibly to allow Leotair to grow as a business. So this is what they like. It's their preference. Now, when the policy changes, these shareholders, they may not want such a large dividend. Okay, so as a result, they may sell their shares and then purchase them in a business that meets their preferences. Okay, so that could be a potential effect. Cash. So a major implication of this is that it will reduce Leotair's liquidity. This is probably the most obvious consequence of this change in dividend policy. So assuming no change in profits, so assuming we keep the same profits, the dividend policy represents a 102% increase in the dividend cash outflow. Okay, so it's a drastic change in the amount of cash that we are spending. And as a result, it may create the impression that this is a one-off bonus rather than a change in dividend policy. So we have to be very careful about how this is communicated. So it may be perceived as like a one-off bonus because it's so large. It's really important here to note the strategic context of Leotair. So we deal with lengthy and material contracts, big contracts, and the company's demand is difficult to forecast. That's mentioned within the pre-scene. So liquidity is important for the business. Okay, we don't necessarily know what our demand is going to be. We need to have cash in the business because these are long contracts. There aren't loads of customers and so on and so forth. So this could create a strain on our liquidity as a result. Okay, so very important there for Leotair in particular. And that's what a level 3 answer, a high level answer, is looking at, is the strategic context. So the share price. So in the immediate term, the change in dividend policy, it's likely to further depress the share price. So we're using the scenario information here. Markets might be confused as to the logic of this. And you're probably confused looking at this. Okay, so going, why have they changed the dividend policy? when this new information has been released. To compete with Orbalink, they should really be investing that cash in the integration of similar technology rather than paying more dividends. So increasing the dividend payout ratio, even though they may feel that it will increase the share price of the business, actually it may lead to some existing shareholders selling their shares in question as to the competence of the board. Why did they do this? They should be investing that cash instead in this new technology to compete with Orbalink. So the change in dividend policy will send signals. So this is the signaling effect. What signals does this send? The most likely scenario is that the market will believe that the board has no alternative use for the cash. So they're increasing the amount of dividends we have very drastically. And there may be a subsequent share price decrease because the markets perceive this as an issue. The board has ran out of ideas effectively, okay? And especially against the backdrop of these recent events where there is a clear area they should be investing cash into, they've decided not to do that. So with no communication of the continuity of the policy as well, we talked about this, markets may believe that it's a one-off, so that might be the signal that we're sending. And if they do believe it's a one-off, then if we have this kind of recurring payout ratio, they may actually sell their shares because they finally realize this is not a one-off bonus. This is actually the way it's going to be into the future. And then they go, okay, this is not what I want in terms of an investment. This doesn't really suit my preferences. So capital structure. So the change in dividend policy will have an impact on the capital structure. Increasing the payout ratio will, materially reduce the company's retained earnings. Having a lower amount of retained earnings increases the gearing ratios. This is just kind of simple looking at the statement of financial position, what's going to change as a result, and this is going to affect the gearing. This becomes an issue for the business, and this is why it's important to develop your points. So why is this relevant? Why is this important? So some people would just say, in the case of, debt covenants, why is this particularly important for the business? Well, if you think about it, if we've debt covenants related to the gearing ratio, well, if we exceed them, we're at risk of fines, sanctions, increased interest rates, and so on and so forth. So we're talking here about the consequences. Debt covenants might also be related to the amount of dividend that you can pay. So actually this change in dividend policy mightn't actually be possible. Okay, so that's another one to consider there. Okay, so again, a bit of a pause. You can tell my voice is actually kind of going down. My voice is, I'm losing it a bit. Okay, so we have another 2 core activities to go through. So just want to make sure we get through them within a reasonable period of time. Okay, so I like your style of answering the questions. They're very straightforward. Well, I appreciate that. Well, one of the biggest assets, I suppose, of teaching so many people across the world is myself, right? I always find that the best feedback that you can get from people is, okay, what you've said is simple to me, right? Because if you understand something, normally you're able to articulate it in a simple way. And for me, I can't understand things if they're sort of put in a very complex way. So sometimes even the official solutions, they don't make 100% sense to me. Sometimes they're overly complicated. So that's great feedback. Thank you so much. Are the sample questions today on your book 2? I only stopped at set 7, so not sure. No, they're not. So the questions that are in here are actually different to the ones that are in the book. Please elaborate on the difference between share price movement and efficient market hypothesis. Is that the same thing? No. So share price movements is just the general movements. Efficient market hypothesis is the kind of, I suppose, the theory around market efficiencies. So, is efficient market hypothesis tested directly ever? No. But it can be something that you can use in your answers. And I think, Stefan, you've answered that. You have. Yeah. Fantastic. Ria, so interest rate volatility and political instability would affect beta. Is that correct? Again, go back to the fundamentals. So think about the business risk and the finance risk. Okay, so it will be heavily context driven. So I'm very careful about answering those questions. But think about business risk and think about finance risk. That's what I would suggest. Very good point, Denise. So what are the chances beta will be tested in May? I would say likely, to be honest, because it was not tested. Well, it was tested in the most recent set of exams, and I believe it was tested in the one before. And CIMA don't really like to recycle questions, but with beta, normally it's very poorly answered. So the examiner, if they're looking at areas to retest, they'll normally retest areas that were answered poorly. Okay, so that's just based on my own personal analysis. That's not based on any information that I got from CIMA or something like that. Just want to caveat that. But I would say it's likely. I mean, the thing with the May exam though is that the May exam only has 3 variants. So, you know, the August has 3 variants as well, and you know you could have beta in those 3 as well. So I don't really know. I couldn't give you a percentage. Yeah, it was. You're right. It was answered really badly. So I would suggest now the only thing to note here is that the exam probably would have been written before those results came out. However, I think it's generally the case that beta is normally answered pretty poorly anyways. So, you know, I don't think that came as a surprise to anyone. Now, the question that was examined was really tough. It was really an awful question, okay? So I don't blame people for, you know, when I say things are answered poorly, I mean, I can understand why it was a really difficult question. Okay, right, so I think that's everything. Okay, you'll have to excuse, there's a bit of banging noise. Basically, I'm just kind of moving my chair here. So I had a bit of a back injury recently, quite a bad one. I had an accident, so I have to move around. I'm kind of taking painkillers before this, which seem to be working, but I just have to move around a little bit just to make sure that I don't scream in pain. So Emmanuel, can you throw more light on scenario planning? Yeah, look, before I get into core activity D, yeah, scenario planning is tested really frequently. And normally what happens is you're given 2 scenarios or 3 scenarios, and you're asked to give an evaluation of how those scenarios would pan out. So how would you develop those, or maybe how would you respond if those scenarios were to appear? Now, those questions are really straightforward because CIMA have given you the scenarios. So you just have to expand upon them, okay, or respond to them. But the key with those questions is to make sure that your answer is specific to the scenarios, okay? I can't say it enough. Make sure that your answer is in alignment with the scenarios that have been given. Don't go off sort of developing your own scenarios if they have given you them, okay? Hope your back gets better. Thank you so much. Yes, I had a really bad, well, not a really bad, but I had a bad accident last week, and it's sticking with me, okay? So it's a bit annoying because some of my work involves just sitting in one place recording things, but thankfully most of the recordings are quite short, so you can kind of walk about and stuff like that. But the main thing is I'm here, and I'm dedicated to getting the rest of this session done, okay? You can probably hear my voice is going a tiny bit, so I just have a bit more water. Okay, so Emmanuel, can there be a variant that's its questions will be on only currency risk like the last variant? So the answer to that is not really. So what you perceive as the paper being entirely based on currency risk, which I totally understand, the core activities don't necessarily work that way. So there was a question on currency risk which would have been related to B, but there are constraints in your exam where you can't just be tested on all currency risk, but the theme was currency risk and treasury. But actually some of the questions were based on other subjects that had currency risk in them. So for example, the question on beta would have been core activity C, but it had elements of currency risk added to it. Could you get another thing like that? Yes, but can you just have 4 or 5 questions on currency risk? No, because the core activity constraints don't allow for it. Okay, so the next one, this is core activity D, and thank you so much for the positive comments, guys. The attendance is insane. I'm so happy with this. 100 is amazing. For these YouTube lives, you'd be lucky to get 20 or 30. So this is really good, and thank you so much for attending this, right? Because it's like a bank holiday in the UK, it's a bank holiday in Ireland, and I have so many people that join from all over the world, and it's fantastic. Some of you, it could be like 10, 11, 12 at night. If you're in South Africa, it's probably pretty late, and I have a lot of customers over there. So thank you so much. Okay, so core activity D. Now this one is a little bit more straightforward. People tend to find this one a bit easier. It's basically P3. Okay, so if you've done the OTs, it's P3, or if you've done the FLP, it's risk management. So evaluate and mitigate risk. So I can evaluate risks and recommend responses and maintain the corporate risk register. I can identify ethical dilemmas and recommend suitable responses. That's kind of tested every single round. I can evaluate and mitigate cyber risks, and I can recommend internal controls. So the first one is risk and non-financial reporting. Now I've put the two together, okay? So risk reporting and non-financial reporting, okay? So just to make the slides a little bit more condensed, the first is risk reporting. So it's knowing the difference between the risk register and the principal risk report. So the risk register very detailed internal risk report. It's normally a spreadsheet. If you've worked in risk management within a big business, you'll know it's normally in Excel, and it's massive, and it's got a ton of details. So it'll have the risk owner, what the risk is, when it was identified, the risk score, which is normally the materiality of it multiplied by the likelihood. Okay, so it's an arbitrary way of prioritizing the risk. When it was last reviewed, what are the mitigation actions? Massive. All the different risks that the business faces. Now, the principal risk report is an externally focused report. It's normally put inside the annual report. It basically lists the most material risks that the business faces, and it's for external consumption. Okay, now where this comes from, just so you're aware, is actually in UK legislation in the Companies Act. To the best of my knowledge, as you can tell, I'm not from the UK, but generally speaking, these exams have themes of UK principles and laws in them, because it the kind of, I suppose that's the nature of it. And basically this risk report is required for listed organizations, and it's just to list out the main risks that they face and how they're managing those risks. So the risk register principal risk reports, we'll look at some potential questions you could get on them, but it's important you know the difference between the two of them. Integrated reporting is a big part of this exam. Sustainability is a huge theme that CIMA love. If you go on LinkedIn and you look at CIMA's posts and what they like, what they engage with, what the events are based on, it's all ESG, sustainability, governance, those types of things. So they love this. Likely they will try to test it in some way. So the range of questions for integrated reporting, pretty limited. Okay, so the impact on the capitals of various different events or decisions. The capitals here, we're referring to the 6 capitals associated with integrated reporting. The challenges in reporting, so it might be difficult to report upon the impact on those capitals. Maybe there's something that we actually can't really tell how it will impact social and relationship capital or manufactured capital. Maybe it's something new. Sometimes you can be faced with a situation where there's an increase and also a subsequent decrease. Okay, so maybe we, build a relationship with the government where we managed to get something. Okay, so we got planning permission, but we did it with aggressive lobbying. So we increased the capital because we built a relationship, but then we decreased the capital because we used such aggressive lobbying. So that can be difficult to challenge. And is it something we want to actually disclose? We have to be very careful about how we disclose that. Okay. Repairing and protecting capitals. So how do we repair the capitals after there has been damage to them? Very simple question, to be honest. So basically what we're being asked here to do is, how do we fix the issues associated with the capital? So for example, if we had social and relationship capital and we had a collision of the satellite with another satellite, in that case, we'd be talking about how to improve the company's reputation. So when I phrase it like that, it's a lot easier instead of repairing capitals. Okay. So that's an important one there. Repairing capitals has come up before in the past. Protecting the capitals is very similar. It's just like repairing the capitals, except it's a little bit more preventative. So something negative happens and we're asked, how do we protect the capitals from this event? Pretty similar. Okay. Implications of non-disclosure. So if we do not make disclosures in relation to, the impact that we have on the environment or social capital, so on and so forth, what are the implications of this? And we kind of talked about it from the perspective of share price. Okay, so there may be a share price movement as a result of this. There may be negative reputation effects. It may not affect anything. Okay, so it depends on the circumstances. Now, cyber risk is a big one, and truthfully, cyber risk tends to be answered quite well because we're all kind of familiar with it. It's something that we hear about. It's something we experience. Maybe if we've been in a business that's been hacked. I've been in businesses where there's been phishing attempts and social engineering attacks. I'm sure you have. If you look at your spam, you'll have loads of examples in your email account of people trying to get your passwords. So this happens day to day, and it's something that I'm sure we're well versed in. So cyber risk, from the perspective of this exam, we may be asked to evaluate cyber risk, which is basically where we're asked, where are the vulnerabilities in relation to cyber risk? So, in terms of looking at what exposure do we have to cyber risk, if we're maybe improving our systems, maybe if we're implementing new systems, that creates exposure because there's changeover, there's new staff, there's maybe a consultancy company working with us on it, that creates exposure, all those various different elements. Of course, it'll be context driven. Managing cyber risk, so having a hot site, firewalls, SIEMs, okay, all these various different things are protections for cyber risk, okay, which is really important for Leo to remember. They have not disclosed this as a risk, even though it is a risk for the business, let's face it. Reporting, so we've talked just there, we've touched on it actually by accident. How do we report cyber risk? Do we report cyber risk? Maybe there's a reason why they have not disclosed it within their risk report. Now, this is a potential scenario where maybe it's the case that the board felt if we disclose this, actually it will cause cyber criminals to focus on us. Okay, so maybe we disclose that we have very valuable data. Maybe they'll look at our risk report and say, okay, here we have a target now. So that could be a potential scenario. It's not 100% certain, but something similar has come up before. The board's role in relation to cyber risk. So they provide leadership, okay, in relation to cyber risk. So they are, the leaders in relation to cyber risk. You may have a director, you may have a specific executive that looks after cyber risk. In the case of Leotard, they don't, but they may look to appoint one within the organization, okay? Or maybe they get one external. Resourcing, so having enough resources there for managing cyber risk, so having a budget, setting a budget for that area, and having a sufficient budget, okay? So it's one thing just to have, a few thousand for this, but cyber risk is a big, expensive area, okay? So we need to have appropriate resources set aside for it. That's the board's role in this case. They would structure, so they would have departments, functions, leadership roles there in relation to cyber risk and cyber security within the organization, and controls. Okay, so making sure that there's controls in relation to cyber risk and that those controls are effective. Now, they wouldn't be involved in implementing the controls, but they would review to see, do we have the controls in place? And they would use internal audit to gauge if those controls are effective, or maybe an outside company. Now, ethics has been tested over and over and over and over again. Some companies within my market actually just sell questions on ethics, which I think is bizarre. But anyways, it is a really testable area, and it's something that actually is pretty straightforward more often than not. Sometimes you can get questions on ethics that are a little bit strange, but normally you're presented with a situation and you have to use the CIMA Code of Ethics to assess, is this ethical, is it not? Okay, that's really what you're being asked to do. Now, you need to know the principles going into the exam. They're pretty straightforward, okay? So the 5 principles from the CIMA Code of Ethics. What I would suggest, my biggest tip in relation to ethics questions, if you don't take anything from this, just take this from this entire session, okay? When you're presented with ethics questions, use the principles, okay? Because it tends to be the case that the marking grids that are used for ethics questions specifically state first principle, second principle, third principle. Did they use the principles? Now, I have seen so many scripts over the last few years where people just give their personal opinions. They say, yes, this is ethical because of such and such. And the answer is written really well. And they probably leave the exam center going, oh, I did really well in that question. But actually, they did terrible because they did not mention the principles. They didn't apply the principles. And what CIMA are looking for you to do is to approach an ethics-based question with an objective mindset, that you're going to use these principles to assess, is this ethical? Is it not ethical? They don't want you to use sort of your personal opinion on the issue. So sometimes they use things like lobbying, redundancies, things like this where people have emotional attachments to issues. Use the CIMA Code of Ethics and, have your own personal opinions on it outside of the exam, but just use the CIMA Code of Ethics, okay? I can't stress it enough. So integrity, being straightforward and honest in professional relationships and business relationships as well. Objectivity means acting free from bias, being objective, that's what it means. Professional behavior, abiding by rules and regulations. Confidentiality, don't disclose information that you've obtained through an assignment unless there's a professional or legal obligation to do so. Professional competence and due care is around an ongoing commitment to professional knowledge. Okay, so those are the kind of summarized versions of those principles. Now, the ethical arguments is another style of question that's come up before. And basically what you're asked to do is to give the ethical arguments for a course of action. Now, this is the exact same thing as applying the principles, except it may be the case that you have some of the principles that are in alignment with the issue or the action that we're about to take, and some that are not. So you could say, yes, from the perspective of ethics, integrity in this case would be maintained, confidentiality would be maintained, but actually the other argument says that objectivity wouldn't and professional competence and due care wouldn't be. So those are the arguments that you can have, okay? So internal controls is the next one. Pretty straightforward, and actually people tend to do really well in these questions. It doesn't come up much, but you may be given a question that says, recommend controls that we can use for managing, social engineering attacks or something, okay? So the nature of the question will drive your answer so much in this question. So here's some suggestions, but please make sure yours is specific to the scenario. So physical controls, things like barriers, turnstiles, physical flows we're trying to control here. Authentication controls, so basically we're making sure the identity of the person is who they say they are. There's lots of different ways in which you can do this. Access controls, so who has access to files and data. Personnel controls are around people, so supervision, training, recruitment, all those various different things. Software controls, so controls in relation to the unauthorized use of software, so we're checking licenses and things like that. Network controls, so making sure that our network is protected. So really simple, really straightforward. Now I went through that quickly because I don't want you to go into the exam and just give a list of controls. Use controls that are very specific to the scenario. It's so important that you do that. Don't just go in and dump, a load of theory. The examiner has said this over and over and over again. Please make sure in that case anyways that the controls are very specific to the scenario. Often the case, you can use simple controls. You can use simple arguments. You don't have to go too crazy in those types of questions. So evaluating and managing risk is a bit of a catch-all. So you may have questions around whether it's reasonable to foresee risk. So would this risk have been reasonably foreseen by the board? Maybe it's something like a cyber attack. And the question says, should the board have foreseen this? And you could say, well, yeah, to an extent they should have, right? Because this is sensitive data that we hold, makes sense, okay? It's a kind of contemporary risk. They really should have foreseen this, but actually there may have been a reason as to why they didn't foresee this risk. Maybe it's a little bit more of a complicated risk. Maybe there's more nuance to it. Okay, so again, we need a little bit more background information there. The role of a risk manager has come up before. It was not answered very well, just thinking back to it. And basically a risk manager is involved in managing the risk that is presented in an organization. Now they have a very broad role, and the role changes depending on the organization. Typically you'll see banks, finance institutions, they'll have risk managers, sometimes many risk managers. They're involved in things as well, like arranging for insurance, ensuring compliance sometimes. So the role of a risk manager is very broad, but generally speaking, they're there to help sort of improve risk management processes, implement risk management procedures, and so on and so forth. Should we have one? Should we not have one? Yes, to an extent we should have one because it helps to manage risk, but the downside of having a risk manager is that in a organization, ideally you want everyone to be involved in the risk management processes. Okay, you don't want to just have one dedicated department that says we're going to look after risk. That's not the best approach to have. You need to have everyone involved in risk within the organization, managing risk within their own role, rather than just having one person there or one department there that manages risk, because it can create complacency. People may in their roles go, well, actually that's the role of a risk manager. Okay, they don't need to care about risk. So that's the wrong culture to have in regards to risk management. You may be given questions around evaluating risk. So these are very context driven. So maybe in this case for Leoter, it's not meeting global standards, changes in the supply chain, upgrading systems, something like that. These are just possible scenarios. So you're asked to evaluate the risk. What are the potential risks that the business will face? Okay, and then you elaborate on that. Managing risk is a bit different. So these types of questions are very context driven, so it's hard for me to give you lots of information on them, but you may be given, scenarios, like I said, around changes in the supply chain. Maybe we have just one supplier for a certain laser component that we've just sourced, and the question is, what are the risks of just having one supplier? How do we manage that risk? So there may be some circumstances where accepting instead of mitigating is appropriate. That has come up before in the past. And maybe you just have to manage the risk associated with a specific risk. So, for example, maybe we have a company that we've acquired. The company has a terrible reputation. That's reputation risk. How do we manage that? And the way in which we can manage that is rebranding. We can address the issues that the business has been associating or has basically had in relation to things like customer service, quality, that typically tend to damage the reputation. Maybe they've had sort of an ethical board or something like that. So we would address those issues. Okay, so let's look at some potential questions here. So risk and non-financial reporting. So recommend with reasons how Leoter's capitals can be repaired following a failed satellite launch. Okay, so how would they be repaired? How would we improve them? Okay, so again, look at the capitals, see which ones you think are the easiest to write about. And again, the number of those that you will use will be based on the percentage that's written beside the subtask. Recommend how the risk of incoming spaceport capacity laws could be or should be reported within the risk register. So this question is asking you, what is contained within the risk register? What should we consider? So the risk owner, who owns the risk, who's responsible for it? So that gives you lots of scope to write about, this person should be, well, actually, here are some potential considerations if we do that. The date of identification, the date of last review, the mitigation actions, the risk score, which we said is comprised of the materiality of the risk. We give it an arbitrary number, and the likelihood, again, we give it an arbitrary number, and you come up with a score. You can talk about how that's a way to prioritize risk, but it's not a great way to do it because it's all just kind of arbitrary. It doesn't really, there's not much of a science to it. So those are the things we should note. Evaluate whether the board was justified in leaving cyber risk off the principal risk report for fear of attracting attention. So we touched on that already. Really, with those types of questions, you have to give a balanced argument, even though it maybe seems ridiculous. So the first side of the argument is that, yes, to a certain extent, they might have been justified. Possibly it would have raised the fact that the business has lots of confidential information, if the disclosure was made incorrectly, if it was too detailed, okay? But of course, cyber criminals would be aware of this anyways. So that's the flip side of the argument. They don't necessarily need to look at a risk report to know that. So the next then, evaluate the arguments for and against cyber risk being a strategic matter for the board to resolve. We kind of touched on this already with core activity A. Is it a strategic matter? Yes, because it's highly material, but they would not be involved on a day-to-day basis implementing controls in relation to cyber risk. The board, yes, it's a strategic matter, but the board has limited involvement here. And in terms of strategic matters, think about the materiality of the issue. If we have, for example, a data breach, if we have, maybe a social engineering attack, think of the type of information that could be stolen. So maybe pictures of maybe confidential areas within a certain country. It's a satellite, okay? So it could be looking at things like prisons, aerial photography of prisons, maybe, Secret Service buildings, those types of things. There's a lot of sensitivity around that. If you're in the UK, for example, if you have a drone, you can only fly a drone around certain areas. You can't have it over an airport, for example, for obvious reasons, but you also can't fly it over a prison. So, if you have a satellite that goes over a prison and takes photography, that could be very sensitive information, okay? Recommend the measures that Leoterra could implement to prevent a social engineering attack. Here we're talking about things like training, penetration testing, those types of things, and related to a control. So penetration testing every 180 days or something like that. Recommend how Leoterra could deal with a cyber attack. So this is very specific to a scenario. So you'll be given information here. Let's say it's a ransomware attack. Do we pay the ransom? No, we shouldn't, because if you pay a ransom in a ransomware attack, you create the risk of the attack occurring again, because they may see you as an easy target, a target that pays, okay? So you kind of attract that reputation as a soft target effectively. And also, there's no guarantee that actually the software will dissipate after you pay. Now, the next tier, ethics. So evaluate the ethical implications of failing to accept responsibility for a faulty satellite as title transfers upon sale. This type of scenario, again, it's going to depend on the background information. So it's very hard to answer these without that information. We're going to cover an ethics question in a few seconds, so don't worry too much about these. Discuss whether it would be ethical to lobby the Wexland government to prevent space junk laws from passing. Again, use your ethical principles here. Evaluate the ethical implications of constructing infrastructure to gain planning permission for a spaceport. So we'll look at that in a second. Internal controls. So recommend internal controls that can be used to enhance the confidentiality of custom satellite design specifications. So physical controls could be used here. Turnstiles, safes for a physical version of these satellite designs. Things like password protection, access controls, encryption, those are all controls. Recommend internal controls that can be used to prevent mistakes when vetting employees. This came up, I think, 2 windows ago. This type of question, it's going to depend very heavily on the context, but things like references, having someone in an interview with technical knowledge, this is a way to assess if someone actually has technical knowledge, if their CV is accurate. That's why typically you'll have a kind of a technical expert in your interviews. Things like references, as we said, and as well training for the people who are actually looking at the applications, making sure they can spot inconsistencies. Recommend internal controls that could be used to enhance the effectiveness of a training program. So, when I just think of my own business, you can have things like assessments. So assessments every so often, these check and see if the person is there. If it's a robot that's going through the online training course, for example, you can have a control around the time of completion. So if it's too short, you can ask the person to repeat the course because maybe they've just kind of clicked through the pages, they've clicked through the videos. These are the types of controls you can have. Evaluation or evaluating and managing risk. Evaluate the risks associated with failing to comply with the non-binding space junk charter. An excellent question because it's so vague, which is very SCS-like. What are the risks? I suppose the main risk is that you possibly are unprepared then. for the implementation of this if it becomes legislation. The other risk, I suppose, is reputation. Possibly it might be the case that if we're dealing with certain types of customers, maybe they want to see us in compliance with this space junk charter, and then you could say maybe there is no real risk. Maybe at the very end you could say to a certain extent it's not legally binding, so we're not going to have legal risk. That could maybe be a final consideration at the end. Evaluate the arguments for and against the appointment of a risk manager following a satellite collision. Is this an appropriate thing to do to resolve the issue? Probably not. Okay, so you could kind of go into the fact that in terms of arguments against, this is not really going to affect this collision that just happened. It may prevent future ones, but risk managers are not necessarily experts in satellites, so the ability for them to prevent this from occurring again is somewhat limited. However, they will have some expertise in managing risks, so that's maybe an argument for. Recommend how the reputational risks associated with acquiring a distributable company can be managed. We just went through that one. So let's look at a worked example here. So Leotair is seeking to construct a spaceport in the country of Iceland. A license to construct a spaceport has been applied for in compliance with Iceland law. One of the Iceland's ministers has reached out to Leotair's board stating that the application can be expedited. The application will be expedited if Leotair invests and this is like the fictional currency associated with Iceland, $10 million into the minister's tree replanting scheme. The minister stated that this will offset the environmental damage in his constituency, which is a key objective for him. Evaluate the ethical implications of investing in the tree replanting scheme. So this type of question came up in the most recent set of exams. This is a big adaptation of it, but it is inspired by it. And here is the answer. So what I would suggest here is look at 3 ethical principles or 4. Okay, so 3 or 4, depends how much you can write. So the first is integrity, and I always recommend with ethics questions you explain the principle first. So integrity involves being straightforward and honest in business and professional relationships. Straightforward, easy, okay, easy to understand. In this instance, the investment would be a breach in integrity. Why? Because it's not a straightforward transaction. It's being purported as an investment in a friendly scheme. It's good for the environment, all that kind of stuff, but actually it is effectively a bribe. So by engaging in this, we're engaging in a non-straightforward transaction. We're basically validating this approach that the minister has taken. The next is objectivity. So this means kind of not allowing bias, conflict of interest, or the influence of other people to override professional judgment. This is the official definition. In this instance, if we look at the facts, so we're not kind of drawn in by the fact that it's in kind of cleaning up environmental damage, it's good for the company, all that kind of stuff. If we just look at the facts, it's effectively a bribe. Okay, so we take the kind of positive elements of the tree replanting scheme out of it, it's a bribe. So an objective review will show that it's unethical. So if we actually engage with this, we would be breaking this ethical principle. So another point to note here is that the board might be swayed by the fact that the minister does not appear to benefit from this financially. Now, we don't actually know this. He might be siphoning the funds out of it. It has been presented to us as kind of a side offer, not as something that's a part of the overall application process. So it does seem like maybe it's a bit sketchy from that perspective as well, from a financial perspective. But just remember that the minister benefits from the reputation of saying that he was able to clean up this environmental damage. So it is effectively a bribe because he benefits from it. Professional behaviour, acting in accordance with laws and regulations effectively. It's highly likely in this case in Iceland that things like bribery and political corruption are illegal. That goes without saying, but it is important to write it down just as a simple assumption, kind of increases the size of your answer. Leotair in its approach so far has operated within the law. It actually specifically mentions that. Accepting the minister's offer would constitute, in this case, bribery and corruption. Okay, so very important there. We've made it very clear that this is a violation of this ethical principle. Even though the minister does not financially gain, he will still take credit for it. He will get an intangible gain out of this. So likely to be bribery and corruption there. The last one is a bit of a stretch, but it could still be used. So professional competence and due care. We're talking about commitment to professional knowledge and skill based on current developments, legislation, techniques. The board risks violating this principle if the investment is accepted because the board should have a reasonable level of knowledge over legislative impacts of carrying out this investment. So they mightn't be experts in Iceland law, but this is a very simple representation of bribery. So therefore, you could say that this actually acceptance of this offer is a violation of this ethical principle. So it shows incompetence. The appropriate action here would be to report the minister's actions rather than engaging with the offer. It's not only illegal, but it might endorse the behaviour. Okay, so it shows that we endorse this kind of disreputable offer, which will be incompetent by the board. So just a bit of a pause here. I'm going to have some water, and then we get into the final section. And once we're done, we will have a bit of a Q&A. I'm conscious everyone probably, we want to wrap this up in 30-40 minutes, so everyone can go to bed. If you're, well, it depends where you're based. Actually, it might be morning where you're based. Okay, 1 second now. Okay, so I'm looking at the comments here. So, join from Zambia. Yeah, thank you so much. I have a ton of customers in Zambia, and it's great to see that you're up. I presume it's pretty late in Zambia at the moment. We have loads of customers in Lusaka. We work a little bit with CIMA Zambia as well. So thank you so much. Okay, are the 6 capitals heavily tested? Not really. Normally they will tell you the ones that they want you to assess a certain situation against. So they normally give you 2 or 3. Weren't those capitals already tested in the MCS? Pretty sure my August MCS. Yeah, they're tested on both. Yeah, CIMA loves IR. Yeah, they tested at SCS and they tested at MCS. They tested on both. It's pretty simple if you know the theory behind it. Yeah, so like integrated reporting is it's normally explained pretty badly. What I would suggest with integrated reporting is in the book that I wrote, I took a lot of the information from the integrated reporting framework, which is actually written in a more easy to understand way than some of the official textbooks, to be honest. So if you do get a chance, look at the integrated reporting framework. It's pretty straightforward. I mean, if you go into the framework, not the textbooks, or use my textbook, which basically takes information from that framework, is a little bit more straightforward. I know what you're saying. The official textbook goes into a lot of information that isn't really relevant for the SCS. So the background to integrated reporting and the kind of the way in which they're put together. The official framework goes into detail on the actual capitals themselves, and it lists out what actually is within those capitals, which is a bit more of a straightforward approach. An ethical argument, should we come up with a final solution, or can we just leave it open-ended? Yeah, can we be diplomatic with the answer, not being straightforward? Yeah, I think so. I think the best way to approach it really is to leave it open-ended. I mean, if you want at the end, you can say this is ethical, this is unethical, but chances are you may have a situation where, more often than not, you'll have some principles being in compliance with it and some not. So you could say, yes, there are some principles here that are in compliance with this course of action, and then some that are not. So there's ambiguity in regards to the ethics of this course of action, or whatever it is, a situation or an event. Okay, guys, so I'm just going to take a bit more water, and we'll get into the last piece, and then we can all go to sleep or do whatever, watch the TV, or go back to studying. I don't know. It's interesting, actually. There's so many different countries represented in these sessions. You might be going to work after this, so I don't know. Rueda, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for attending. What can Nearther do if its competitor was cyber attacked? Very little is the answer. So if it's a competitor was cyber attacked, I suppose there's nothing they can really do about that situation for the competitor, but they can protect themselves based on the nature of that attack. Okay, so based on what happened, Leother can maybe implement its own set of controls to prevent that from occurring for themselves. Okay, so let's get stuck into core activity E. So core activity E is really short. So I recommend and maintain a sound control environment. I can apply internal audit resources. I can recommend appropriate controls and evaluate the implications of compliance failures. I can recommend responses to the threats arising from poor governance. Okay, let's get stuck into it. So internal audit is a really testable area. It's normally really badly answered. I'm just being very blunt about that. That's sort of the way I like to be. I just like to be straightforward with people. It normally is tested between 50 to 60% in terms of a question, and the answers are just not really addressing the core issues raised. Okay, so a very, very repeated theme in terms of the SCS. The nature of the questions does not change too much, so an important one to be aware of. So the first area that you need to be aware of is using internal audit. So should we use internal audit to do XYZ? Should we use them for this, assignment or whatever? So these are the factors we should consider when we're asked a question like this. So yes, internal audit tend to have expertise around investigations. They tend to be very good at, kind of auditing, as reviewing, observation, all those kind of things. But they don't necessarily have expertise in things like cyber risk or, environmental issues. And so the way in which we use them, we can't expect them to do too much in regards to technical areas. Okay, so that's something we need to consider. Annual plans. So typically internal audit work to an annual internal audit plan. If we ask them to do a specific assignment, we need to be very careful, because if it's a big assignment, you will push that plan back and it will cause capacity issues. Okay, so that's something to consider. Internal audit are most effective when they're independent. Okay, we need to maintain that as much as possible. To a certain extent, it's hard to do that because internal audit are paid by the organization in which they work in. So there isn't always that independence there, but we just need to, as much as possible, make sure they're independent when they're carrying out an assignment. And the signaling effect of using internal audit. So when we use internal audit for an investigation or an assignment, we're saying that this is important. Okay, so think about that as a reason for using internal audit. The work performed by internal audit. So this question comes up a lot. What is the work that they would perform if they were to do this? If they were to, investigate this? This will depend on the scenario, very much so, but typically it's things like compliance testing, testing controls, substantive testing, it's testing balances, financial balances normally. Analytical review is a form of substantive testing where basically you're testing financial data trends, so differences between actual and budget. That's a form of analytical review, something that an external auditor would do. If there's any people here working in external audit, you will have used that, I'm sure, on an assignment. Confirmation, okay, so confirming something, observation, surveying, interviewing, checking, reviewing, examining. These are all the various different things they do. Board committees, so the role of the different committees. So the nomination committee is involved in nominating members to the board, okay? Really important role there. Remuneration committee, so they're basically in charge of setting the pay or the remuneration for the executive directors and the senior managers, not the non-executive directors. They don't set their own pay. Risk, so the risk committee has oversight over the risk management processes of the organization, and the audit committee has a big role in a business. If there's no risk committee, they perform that role. They tend to recommend the external auditors. They tend to lead the internal audit department, and they also have responsibility for ensuring that the financial statements reflect a true view of the organization's performance. Now, you may have questions around resignations or appointments to board committees. This has never come up before, but I think it could be an interesting one where maybe we have a question as to whether we should appoint a member to a board committee. Is that appropriate to do so? What type of expertise should they have? Maybe someone resigns, that creates a space for them. The formation of committees, so you may have questions around the arguments for and against the creation of a new committee that's outside of these four. So there, in the real world, there's lots of different types of committees that can be formed that are very different to these. So you can have ones on ethics, you can have sustainability, you can have quality, you can have compliance, you can have lots of different committees. So the arguments for is that it tends to improve scrutiny and challenge over that specific area. The arguments against is that it can create a clash between the executives and the non-executives if it's a very operational area. So if it's something like quality, you may have a kind of a confusion there within the organization. Who's responsible for quality? Is it the executive directors or is it the non-executive directors? Okay, so governance issues. This is a little bit more of a catch-all, I suppose, for governance problems. Directors' remuneration. So this has come into the exams a lot more in recent times. Changes in remuneration. So should we change remuneration in relation to maybe an acquisition? Maybe we have more responsibility for directors. Should their pay keep up with that added responsibility? The answer to that question is difficult. So the answer there is, well, it depends. So if we want to improve their motivation, maybe they're causing issues, maybe they're kind of repeatedly saying we need to change our remuneration package. Yes, it would improve their motivation, improve their commitment. However, if they have performance-related elements such as, stock options or shares, their extra effort is going to be encompassed in that anyways. So if they work harder and they generate shareholder value, that's going to be reflected in that pay anyway. So that's something just to bear in mind. Performance related pay. So possibly we could have a question around tying goals to the pay of directors. So there was a question around whether directors should be compensated for goals in relation to climate change and things like that. So really with those types of questions, just make sure that the goal that the pay is being tied to is very clear and attainable. Okay, so if it's something that's very esoteric, right? Basically, it's something that's hard to actually track. You can cause a lot of problems with those types of pay packages. Board appointments, so nominating members to the board. Should we have another non-executive director? Should we have an executive director? Those are very common questions within the SCS, and a bit of a spoiler, the worked example goes through this, so we'll cover that when we get to the very end. Post-acquisition issues. So let's say, for example, we acquire a business and then there's issues in terms of governance. Okay, so what type of issues? The retention of the acquired company's board. Should we keep them? Should we nominate them to our group board? What do we do with them? Should we have senior managers running them? Okay, so that's important to consider. The risk management processes, they need to be aligned. Okay, so when we acquire a business, they will face their own set of risks. And if those risks are very material, they're going to be the risks of the group. So that needs to be reflected in the group's risk reports. It needs to be reflected in the principal risk report, and also the risk management processes need to be aligned. They need to be the same. Controls. So the acquired business needs to have, a set of controls, same approach as the group business that has just acquired it. And in terms of reporting, we need to make sure that they are reporting their financials accurately, okay, so that we get to monitor their performance. Really important there from a governance perspective. Okay, the control environment has been tested, I believe, twice in the last 11 windows, so it hasn't been tested much. Will it be tested for this paper? I don't know, okay, but if it is tested, you'll be kind of prepared for it. So the control environment refers to the attitude towards internal controls within an organization effectively, and you may get questions around the impact on control environment. So let's say, for example, we have an event, like maybe a director is dismissed. Okay, so maybe they broke the rules in a certain country, maybe they were accused of bribery, maybe they acted unethically, and we dismiss them. How would that affect the control environment? Well, it would probably have a positive effect, because it would show that we've gotten kind of, it maybe sounds a bit harsh, we've gotten rid of a director that was acting unethically, therefore we take ethics serious as a business. However, if you have a certain period of time where we have no director over a certain area, there's a lack of oversight there, which leaves a risk for a deterioration of the control environment if we don't fill that gap. Board actions, so if the board acts unethically, that's going to have an effect on the control environment negatively. Improving the control environment, so maybe we acquire a business, we actually find out the control environment is very poor, so how do we improve it? You do things like have a board that respects ethics, that takes ethics seriously, and has a strong tone at the top in relation to ethics, rules, laws, compliance, controls, and so on and so forth. Having controls within the organization is important as well. Having things like training, organizational structures, really important in relation to improving the control environment. The next is the implications. So when you have a good control environment, you have an effective control environment, what are the implications or the consequences of that? So one of the main consequences is that you have reduced compliance risk. Okay, so people tend to sort of act within the rules, therefore we have less laws being broken, less legal risk, and more ethical behavior within the organization. Okay, so that's kind of two implications. Impact of poor control environment, so it's the opposite. You have increased risk of fraud, you have increased risk of compliance failures, or controls not being respected. Okay, so operational risk then kind of creeps in. So potential questions here. So internal audit, we actually kind of covered them off, to be honest. So recommend the work that internal audit could perform to ensure the confidential satellite designs are secure. So, in terms of the work that internal audit would perform, they would look at the controls here. So if we have controls in relation to where the designs are kept, so if they're put in a safe, they would test to see, is that safe secure? Is it a biometric one? Is it a padlock? Whatever. They would test to see if the relevant members of staff have access to it. Does maybe an outside contractor have access to it that they shouldn't have? Testing those controls in relation to the satellite design. So that's the type of work they would do. It's checking, investigating, reviewing. Okay. Evaluate the arguments for and against internal audit reviewing Leotair's adherence to the Space Junk Charter. So one of the main arguments for is that they're well able to investigate. They have those skills. Arguments against is that they don't necessarily have precise skills on satellite design and global standards. Therefore, their ability to investigate will be limited, although effective, but will be limited. And of course, it could affect the audit plan. Those are the other considerations. Now, this question has actually been mentioned within the textbook that I wrote. So, discuss the role of the audit committee when there is an internal audit assignment investigating quality testing failures. This has never really been tested before, and it's something that, if it came up, I think would be pretty poorly answered. So the role of the audit committee in this case is very kind of, I suppose, context driven. Okay, so the first thing that they would do is they would approve the objectives of the audit. Okay, so they would work with the chief internal auditor on that. They would approve of the assignment ultimately. They would set a deadline, which then kind of sets the resources that would be used for that. They provide oversight over the auditing process, and then at the end they challenge the auditing approach that the internal auditors used, or the chief internal auditor sort of approved. The next then, so the board committees. So evaluate the claim that the risk committee should change composition after failing to foresee a cyber risk. So this has never been tested before, but quite an interesting question. So they failed to foresee this risk, therefore should the composition of the risk committee change? And you could argue both sides. Okay, so yes, maybe it should change. Maybe we need to have people that are a little bit more active in terms of risk management. Maybe it was incompetence that led to this lack of foresight. However, we need to think about the executive team as well. So it's not just the risk committee that's involved in identifying risks, it's also the executive directors. So maybe we need to look at the executive directors. It's not necessarily just a risk committee issue. Recommend the factors that the remuneration committee should consider when assessing executive remuneration. So this question is difficult, it's never been tested before. The factors they should consider, the performance of the business is the biggest one. And if you look at the share price of Leotair, the share price is a bit of a disaster over the last few years. So that's going to be a factor when they look at the remuneration. Industry standards are really important. So what's going on in the industry, what's normal, economic factors, so inflation, obviously quite important as well. Those are the different things they would look at. And also, the reputation of the directors. They kind of consider, is this very disproportionate to the average amount that the person, a kind of a regular employee, is paid within the organization? That's something they would consider. Evaluate the arguments for and against the establishment of a quality committee to discuss quality and testing processes. So we kind of touched on this already. Evaluate the arguments for and against appointing a non-executive with a background in sustainability. So this type of question comes up every now and again. The arguments for, in this case, could be a good representation of this issue at a board level. If it's important for the business, they will have that technical expertise. They'll be able to advise, challenge on sustainability. Great expertise to have for a business like Leotair. In terms of the negatives, there's a risk that they may become operationally responsible for sustainability. So really, we should be getting non-executives from a fresh background. That tends to be the case for large organizations, that they can effectively challenge and not be caught up in the operations of the business. Evaluate the claim that a data breach following a cyber attack arose due to poor corporate governance. So this is a really tricky question. It's come up before. This type of question, we need to think about corporate governance issues. Did we have effective internal controls? Did we have effective risk management processes? Did we have the right structuring? Did we resource cyber risk? Those are the questions we need to ask ourselves. And then we need to think about the fact that, a cyber attack may have arose anyways, even if we had good corporate governance. It's whether we managed it effectively. Evaluate the governance challenges faced by Leotair after acquiring a previously unlisted satellite startup, or an AI startup, so kind of like a software company. Challenges here would be around internal controls, mostly because it's an entrepreneurial type business. It may be difficult to introduce that level of bureaucracy into the business. Remember that a listed business faces more scrutiny over its governance than a startup business. Therefore, it'd be quite a radical change for a business like this to have new internal controls and to have a set of governance processes. Okay, so the next for the control environment. So evaluate the impact on the control environment of the board failing to accept responsibility for quality issues. So a really kind of tricky one there. So, in terms of evaluating the impact, it's going to have a negative impact. Okay, so if they fail to accept responsibility and it is very clearly the company's fault, well, this says that actually the board does not really respect rules, regulations, because possibly this could fall into legal risk as well. And also ethics, okay? So it's going to deteriorate the control environment. Discuss the impact that the dismissal of an executive director would have on the control environment. We talked about that specifically. And recommend ways in which the control environment of a newly acquired company could be improved. We also talked about that. Okay, so let's look at this worked example. This is a good question. So Leotair has just acquired 100% of Neosat, which is a company that specializes in VLEO satellites, very low Earth orbit satellites. So Neosat is an unlisted entity, very important there, that has been in business for a period of 5 years, with each year being unprofitable. The entity was acquired so that Leotair could enter the VLEO market rapidly with Neosat's innovative technology. Leotair acquired the company using a cash offer financed with debt with no earn-out arrangement in place, and that's also quite important in this case. So it's been suggested that Cynthia Rotain, who's the CEO and founder of Neosat, be appointed to the Leoter board. Evaluate the arguments for and against appointing Cynthia as a non-executive director to the board. That's worth 50%. Okay, so this question is tricky. So evaluate the arguments for and against appointing Cynthia as a non-executive to the board. If it was an executive, you'd have a different set of answers here. So be very careful when you're reading the question. So the first point, arguments for, it will cause a rebalance of the board. So at the moment, our board is comprised of 4 non-execs, 5 executive directors. Now, I know you're probably thinking about the chair. Just give me 2 seconds. Robust corporate governance suggests that at least half the board should be non-executives. These principles remove the chair, so technically we would still need to have another non-executive appointment to bring the balance in alignment, so 50-50, okay? Now, in this case, how do we develop the answer beyond this? We think of the benefit of having an additional non-executive director. This is the difference between level 2 and level 3 answers. So level 3 is the best you can have. Level 2 is sort of the average answer, okay? So the difference between level 2 and level 3 is the level 3 will go into more detail here. So what's the benefit of this? Why would shareholders care? Why is this important? So shareholders would likely appreciate a stronger non-executive presence. Why? Because it creates more challenge. It enhances oversight. It reduces executive domination. Okay, so that's something that is really important for shareholders. They don't want to have the business just completely ruled by executive directors and, you know, kind of short-term interests and all the sort of negatives that come along with that. So the arguments for in terms of expertise. So she founded this business. She likely has extensive knowledge in VLEO satellites and also probably just the satellite industry in general. Her technical knowledge and insight into Neosat would be very useful at this key integration time. Okay, so they're integrating the business into the overall group business. Her challenge, okay, so when they say challenge, it's basically scrutiny, would be backed up with technical knowledge and insight, so be well informed, which is really good to have on the board. Her appointment would also assist with retention for staff at Neosat because they would see that someone at the highest levels of the organization is representing them. Okay, so they're kind of there representing the business. Okay, so very good. Now, arguments against, probably a little bit easier. So in terms of independence, best practice, and when we say best practice, we're referring to the UK Code of Corporate Governance, is to have at least half the board be independent non-executive directors, excluding the chair. So in this case, Cynthia is heavily conflicted. She's not independent because she was the CEO of a business that's now integrated within the group. So given her impaired independence, she's likely to kind of have compromised objectivity as a result. So when we have decisions around things like redundancies within Neosat, which is likely because it's unprofitable, we'll have things like, you know, efficiency savings where we'll have possible redundancies. Her personal relationships with the staff may actually impair her objectivity and therefore may make decisions which are suboptimal. Okay, so she can still be appointed as a non-executive. This is kind of an extra layer, but she needs to declare that she has impaired independence. And this is something that happens in the real world. So some companies, for example, I believe Walmart, they have non-executive directors that are not independent. Okay, so that can be the case. You just have to declare it in the annual report. So arguments against the strategic direction of the business, it's likely to change as a result of this acquisition. Okay, so if we have the original founder of the business on the board, there may be issues here because it may encourage, you know, kind of continuity. Okay, so Cynthia might be there trying to encourage a lack of change or a lack of movement in the fundamentals of the business because she will have that impaired objectivity. It may encourage her to advocate for suboptimal decisions, as it says here. So Leoter has to obtain value out of this business. So it's an unprofitable business. So either they have to extract the innovative technology and basically leave the business unprofitable, or they make drastic changes to, you know, improve the profitability of the business, which may involve unpopular decisions. She may not be in favor of that because of her impaired independence. Because of the drastic change in strategic direction required, she's not really appropriate in this case. Okay, it may be the case that we need new leadership. She actually should maybe be removed from the equation altogether. Now, the nature of the role is a really important one here. We're showing that we understand what a non-executive director is. So the independent non-executives, they tend to come from unrelated industries or from NGOs or from a political background so that they can provide a fresh perspective. We could give an example of this within our current set of directors. When you have a person like this as a non-executive director, her perspective may actually align with the executive team because of her experience and her commercial insight. Now, in this particular case, if she is there to improve the integration process or to make it smooth or to provide technical support, she shouldn't be a non-executive. She should really be an executive. Okay, so this is showing the difference between the two. However, there are some drawbacks with her being executive. Okay, so this increases the imbalance that we have in terms of executives and non-executives. So another alternative here, probably the most suitable one, is that she is retained as a strategic consultant for a limited period of time. Okay, so look, I'm here to just quickly talk about my course for August. Now, I'm thinking of closing it soon, okay, because I have really high numbers, and I'm not saying that as a pressure technique or anything like that. You know, when you purchase a course from me, it actually tells you how many people are on the course, so you don't need to take my word for it. Basically, the course that I offer, I believe, is the best in the market, and trust me, I really stand by that, okay? I put myself out there, and I don't brag about things, but I do put myself out there probably more than anyone in this industry. And if I say something, you know, it's there on a recording. So if I say it's probably one of the best courses in the market, I stand by that. Okay, I'm not going to edit that out of this video. I believe it's one of the best options. Why? Because we have all the full SCS specific theory videos in 4K. They're recorded with studio quality. I took a lot of time to do these recordings. One of the recordings on ecosystems I did over 52 times. So the quality is really important to me. It really matters a lot to me. Highly testable topic theory videos. So basically we take this theory here, we put it into professional studio quality, expert pre-scene analysis in 4K quality, access to our SCS textbook, only on the platform, okay? So we can't actually download it yet because of IP protection. 2 assessment sets, which are 2 out of 3 sections from a SCS mock. 3 mock exams with feedback, payment plans. Just note with the assessment sets as well and the mock exams, these are really challenging mocks and assessments. They're as realistic as possible. They're written to exam standards. I try as much as possible. So this is not like even related to anything really, but I try as much as possible to diversify the topics. So overall in the course, I think there's 46 questions, and I test a different topic every single question to ensure that there's a wide span of questions tested, okay? And I do that with nearly every single round as much as possible. There's payment plans, past assurance. The past assurance is basically related to the result that you get in the official exam, so that there's no conflict of interest between pro-accountancy and your performance, okay? So it can be the case with some providers where they relate them to mock exams, which to me seems heavily conflicted. And there's direct contact with the expert tutor. I don't offer one-on-one sessions. I don't offer private tuition. That's not something I do. As I said, you know, I probably reach thousands of students each window. It just wouldn't be feasible. So that's important to note there. So Q&A, okay, so let's do a bit of Q&A, and then I need to head because I can hear my dog tumbling in the kitchen and I'm worried that he'll start barking and we can hear it in the recording, okay? So let's look at some questions. So Sylvia, I think, okay, or I'll go back a bit. Okay, so Ria, so can we have a question where the board executive member is fired? Yeah, that has happened before. You can have a question where someone is dismissed, and the question was actually on the control environment. It was what effect that would have on the control environment rather than a governance question, but it was still core activity E. So yes, you could have a question on that. Rueda, does it matter that the CFO of Leother does not have relevant financial qualifications? Not really, because you know, when you look at companies, for example, in the United States, sometimes you have CFOs that have zero financial experience, even for massive organizations. If you look at some companies, the company that owns Burger King, I think it's called International Restaurants or something like that, the CFO was, I think, in their 20s or something, and they had an MBA from a prestigious university, which is great to have, but they don't necessarily have CPA or CIMA or CGMA, ACCA, ICAW, whatever. So it wouldn't really be that relevant, no, because in other countries it doesn't really matter. So for example, in a country like Portugal, for example, or Spain, you know, you may have a CFO that has an MBA rather than a, you know, an accountancy qualification. So Sylvia, so I think I missed the answer on this. Are these questions in your book? I haven't finished it yet. No, these questions are not in the book. Okay, so these are separate questions. Hugh has said they're different. Yeah, thank you so much, Stefan. Denise, so what if we're sitting in May? It makes no sense signing up to the August SCS before we get the results. But what happens if all the places are already gone then? Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. If you're looking to sit the exam in May, the course is not going to be maybe appropriate for you. So, you know, the May exam is kind of just around the corner, so you raise a good point there. This is for people who are sitting the August paper from scratch. So some people just would do the August window without having done the May window. So if you're someone who's thinking of doing it in the future, maybe you're on the stream for that reason, that's who it appeals to. What I would suggest, Denise, is just reach out to me, once you get your results. If there's room there, great, then we can do the transaction. If there's no room, then I can't. Okay, so in terms of capacity, there's already a ton of people on the course, and I just have to make sure that the marking is done within the 48-hour time frame that we suggest. So it'll just be a kind of I suppose, a case-by-case basis. So reach out to me when you get your results. That's what I'd suggest. The WhatsApp number is there, so if you text me on WhatsApp, like I said, case by case, we can kind of consider it if you want to flag that maybe you might think of setting the course if you don't get the result that you think you will get, or what you want to get, which is a pass, obviously. Sylvia, so what do you suggest to do in the next 2 weeks, Hugh? I would suggest, mocks are really important at this stage, practice questions, exposure to different scenarios that may come up. Things like this are important as well, just looking at what could be tested on the paper. So kind of getting a bit more technical, looking at questions and so on and so forth. That's really the key application at this phase, because you should probably know a lot of the theory, the basics of the theory, but really it's more about practice at this stage. So mock papers, ideally. You can hear my voice is absolutely in tatters. Okay, so is there any more questions, guys, before I leave you? Thank you so much. The attendance is amazing. It's amazing how many people stay. It's just such a long session, really, when you think about it. It's amazing that people stay on it so long. So thank you so much. Actually, to give you some information, this is probably double what we had last time. So I'm really grateful. I'm really honest about that. I think it's amazing. I'm not just saying it I'm surprised so many people turned up, to be honest with you. So thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. Crystal, thank you so much. Stefan, I really appreciate it. Susie, I think we're all kind of just like done. If there's any other questions, best 3 hours of my bank holiday. Yeah, so totally, it was great use of time. I think, if you're studying for the upcoming exam, May, August, whatever, it's a great use of time, isn't it? Just even to discuss the exam, to start thinking about it, having, a set period of time to look at different things that could come up. It's a great thing to do with your time, in terms of studying. Taiwo, thank you so much. Ria, thank you so much. Denise, no problem at all. Thank you so much for attending. Right, I think that pretty much wraps it up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just close off the session. There's a bit of a delay, so if you have any questions, I have a group WhatsApp. So just, let me know if you want to be added to that. There's like 260 people in it, so it's a bit crazy, in terms of the membership. But let me know and I'll add it to you. There's a limitation of 999 people on WhatsApp, so we've a bit to go. Thank you so much, guys. I think I'm seeing many familiar names, so I really appreciate the continued support. Add me on LinkedIn, okay? So the last thing I want to say is add me on LinkedIn. I'm always releasing free stuff and like previews, advice, examiners, feedback stuff. Add me on LinkedIn, because I really do try as much as possible to put useful things out there for free as much as I can. So check me out on LinkedIn. All right, guys, thank you so much for everything. I'm going to just turn off the session now. So best of luck with your studies, best of luck with your exam, and I'll talk to you soon.